The laundry line ran along the eastern side of Maren Voss's yard, stretched between two wooden posts she had hammered into the ground herself the week she moved in. It was a simple thing, that line. Rough rope, slightly frayed at one end, with 10 wooden pegs clipped along it like birds on a wire. She had not thought much about it when she put it up. She thought about it even less on the evenings she hung her sheets out to dry, moving between the posts in her quiet, unhurried way, smoothing wrinkles from the fabric before she clipped each corner into place. She tucked a lavender sachet into every hem. She had done this since she was a girl. Her grandmother had taught her, back in the old farmhouse where the summers were long and the linen closet smelled like dried flowers all year round. The sachets kept the moths away, her grandmother said, though Maren suspected her grandmother simply liked the smell. She did too. Lavender was clean and soft and a little bit sharp all at once, and when the evening wind moved through the sheets, the whole yard filled with it. She found that calming. She needed calm. The border town of Edenvale was not a loud or complicated place, but it sat right at the edge of pack territory, and living near a boundary had its own kind of tension, quiet and constant, like a note held just below the range of hearing. Maren was not afraid of wolves. She had been born and raised in towns like this one, and she had learned early that fear without cause was just exhaustion wearing a mask. She had never seen a wolf do anything threatening. She had seen them, once or twice, moving through the tree line at dusk. Large shapes that made no sound, gray and silver, and once, memorably, a deep black that seemed to absorb the last of the evening light. But they kept to themselves, and so did she. That was the agreement, unspoken but reliable, between the human settlement and the packlands that bordered it. She clipped the last sheet into place and stood back, brushing her hands on her apron. The sun was going down behind the hills. The light had turned that particular shade of amber that made everything look slightly warmer than it was. She gathered her empty basket and went inside, leaving the laundry to the evening breeze. She did not know that the evening breeze was not the only thing moving through her yard. 3 weeks earlier, a large gray wolf had followed her scent through the market square of Edenvale without meaning to. He had been there for a practical reason, not to browse or wander, but to assess the border quietly, the way he did every few months, wearing the shape of his animal self because it drew less attention than a man in a dark coat who looked like he owned everything he stood near. He had moved along the back of the market stalls, his paws silent on the packed earth, his nose cataloging everything in the usual order: wood smoke, cured meat, cut grass, axle grease, fresh bread, and then something else. It stopped him completely. He stood between two stalls with his nose lifted and his ears very still, which was not like him. He was not by nature or by training a creature who stopped. He had spent 11 years becoming a person who moved forward through everything, who processed, decided, and advanced with the smooth efficiency of a river that has learned to go around obstacles rather than stop at them. He did not linger. He did not pause. He did not stand between market stalls with his nose in the air like a confused pup. He stood there for 4 full minutes. The scent was lavender, but it was more than that. It was lavender pressed into warm linen, and beneath it something else, something that belonged entirely to one specific person, a quiet, lived-in warmth, like a house with a fire going, that you have not been inside yet but you already know you could sleep there. It moved through him in a way he could not name, and had not experienced in long enough that for a moment, he simply had no category for what he was feeling. Then a child ran past him with a wooden toy and broke the moment, and he was moving again, following the scent thread without consciously deciding to, tracking it out of the market square and down a side lane and along a dirt path that wound toward the eastern edge of town. He stopped himself at the gate of a small yard, a cottage, stone-built, with a vegetable garden to one side and, along the eastern wall, a laundry line. Empty, at this hour, but the scent was everywhere here, concentrated, home. He stood at the gate for 40 minutes. He did not go in. He left before she came out. His name was Kalen Dre, and he was the alpha king of the Voss territories, which was an irony he did not find funny, given that her last name was Voss and the territories had taken that name from a founding family 300 years dead. He ruled 11 packs across 4 regions. He had dissolved 2 wars before they started, rebuilt a trade network after a decade of isolation, and earned the kind of respect that made experienced wolves go quiet when he walked into a room. He was not a sentimental person. He was not a person who did things without reason. 3 days after his visit to her gate, he sent his beta. Ren was a compact, practical man with dark eyes and the expression of someone who had accepted a very long time ago that his job would sometimes ask strange things of him. He had been with Kalen since they were both 19, which meant he had seen things he would take to his grave, and he kept a running private count of which of those things were the strangest. He revised the count that evening when Kaelin told him, without looking up from the papers on his desk, that there was a laundry line on the eastern edge of Edenvale, and that he needed Wren to go there after dark and bring something back. Bring what back? Wren said. Something from the line. A pause. Something small. Something that won't be noticed. Wren said nothing for a moment. He had many follow-up questions. He asked none of them. He had learned, over 11 years, that certain questions were not productive. He bowed slightly and went to get his coat. The first item he brought back was a pillowcase. Kaelin was at his desk when Wren set it down. He did not look at it immediately. He finished reading the sentence in the document he was holding, set the document aside with deliberate calm, and then he did look at it. Plain white linen. One lavender sachet still pinned to the corner, the small bundle of dried flowers pressed flat from being folded against the fabric. Wren watched the Alpha King pick up the pillowcase and hold it in both hands. He watched him press it briefly to his face. He watched him lower it, fold it neatly across his forearm and say, "Thank you, Wren. That will be all." Wren left the room. In the corridor outside, he stood very still for a moment, looking at the wall. Then he continued down the hallway, because there was nothing else to do, and because he was a beta, and because some things you simply file away and never speak of. Maren noticed the missing pillowcase in the morning when she pulled the laundry in. She stood at the line with the empty peg in her hand and counted backward. 8 items out, 7 items in. She walked the perimeter of her yard, checked both fence posts, looked in the vegetable garden in case it had blown loose and snagged on something. Nothing. She held the empty peg for a moment, then shrugged, put it in her pocket, and went inside. She assumed the wind, but Maren Voss was not a woman who made assumptions lightly. She was a herbalist by trade, and herbalists develop a particular kind of attention, the habit of noticing small things, small changes, small presences that do not belong. She had learned to read her garden the way other people read faces, watching for the signs of what was thriving and what was struggling, and what was eating things it should not eat. She brought that same attention to her house and her yard without thinking about it. It was just how she moved through the world. So when a second item disappeared 2 days later, a plain linen scarf she had owned for 6 years, she noticed faster. She did not panic. She stood at the line in the gray morning light and ran through the possibilities with methodical calm. Wind was still a candidate. So was a neighbor, though she could not imagine why any of her neighbors would want an old gray scarf. So was something with paws, though she could not think what animal would take laundry for any practical purpose. She went inside, drank her tea, and thought about it. The footprints were what she should have looked for first. She realized this the next morning, standing in her yard with her basket on her arm, looking at the ground near the base of the eastern fence post. The grass was soft there, always slightly damp from the shade, and in the soft grass, very large and very clear, were the prints of an enormous paw. 4 toes, a wide pad, the impression deep enough to suggest significant weight. She crouched down and looked at them for a long time. Then she stood up, went inside, finished her tea, and thought about the situation with the concentrated attention of a woman who has found something genuinely interesting. She was not afraid. She thought about that, testing the feeling the way she tested a tincture, carefully, looking for what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. No, not afraid, curious. And beneath the curiosity, something else, something she did not have a clean name for yet, something that sat quietly in her chest and waited. That evening, she hung her laundry, as she always did. She smoothed the sheets, clipped the pegs, tucked the lavender sachets into the hems. She went inside. She did not look back. Inside the pack hall, 12 kilometers north along the tree line, Kaelin Dre sat at the head of a long table and listened to his counsel argue about a water rights dispute between the Fen Pack and the border settlements. He tracked the argument with one part of his mind and spent the rest of it in a place he was not going to examine too closely, a quiet internal room, where a plain pillowcase sat folded on a shelf and smelled like lavender and warm linen, and a person he had never spoken to. He had a good counsel. They were experienced, practical people who had earned their places at the table. He trusted their judgment on most matters. But in the 4 weeks since the market, he had noticed a peculiar thing. He was present in every meeting, and he was also always slightly elsewhere. He gave the right answers. He made the right decisions. Some distant, functioning part of him handled those things with the same steady efficiency as always. The rest of him was at a laundry line on the eastern edge of Edenvale, at dusk, in the amber light, watching sheets move in the wind. "My king," Wren said quietly, from the chair to his right. Kaelin refocused. The council was looking at him, waiting. He had let a silence go too long. He picked up the thread of the water rights dispute and drew it to a resolution in 4 sentences, which was how he handled most things, efficiently, clearly, without excess. The council dispersed. Wren stayed. "The scarf," Kaelin said, before Wren could say anything. "Thank you." Wren had brought the scarf 2 evenings ago. Kaelin had not mentioned it until now. Wren said, "Of course," in the tone he used when he had been rehearsing saying nothing about something for several days. "I need you to go again," Kaelin said. Wren said nothing. "Something small," Kaelin said. "Nothing that would be significantly missed." Wren looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Kaelin. "She may have noticed," he said. "The pillowcase." "She may have," Kaelin agreed. "If she has, she may be watching. She may be. And if she notices again, then we will address that," Kaelin said, in the tone that ended conversations. Wren nodded. He left to get his coat again. What Kaelin did not say, and what Wren probably knew anyway, because Wren knew most things, which was the primary reason Kaelin had kept him close for 11 years, was that he had walked past her gate again, 2 nights ago. On his own, in wolf form, in the dark. He had not intended to. He had been running the border as he sometimes did at night, moving through the territory in a wide loop that kept his sense of the land current and his mind clear. The run had taken him south, as runs sometimes did, along the tree line toward Edenvale. He had not turned east deliberately. And yet, he had stood at her gate for 23 minutes this time. The lavender was fainter at night, the yard dark and still, the cottage windows lit behind their curtains. He had watched the light in the kitchen window without moving. At one point a shadow crossed the light, her silhouette, moving inside, doing some ordinary evening task, and something in him went very quiet, the way deep water is quiet. He had left before the light went out. He was not going to think about what that meant. He was thinking about it constantly. He went back to his papers and read the same paragraph 4 times and retained nothing of it, and this had been happening for 4 weeks, and he was beginning to suspect that it was not going to stop on its own. Outside, Wren walked the 12 kilometers to Edenvale in the dark and stood at the edge of Maren Voss's yard and looked at the laundry line. There was a fresh bundle on it, white linen, a sheet, and beside it, very deliberately placed, something that had not been hanging there at sunset. A small bundle of fresh lavender, tied with a blue thread, clipped to the line at precisely eye height for a person standing at the fence. Wren looked at it for a moment. He looked at the cottage. The kitchen light was on. He took the lavender bundle very carefully, tucked it into his coat pocket, and walked back north through the dark. He set it on Kaelin's desk without a word, between the stack of unread reports and the cold cup of tea. Kaelin looked at it. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "She knows." Wren said, "I think she's known for a few days." Kaelin picked up the bundle with one hand. Fresh lavender, bound tight, still fragrant. Not something left on a line by accident, placed, deliberately, with full knowledge of who was going to take it. "She didn't take it down," he said. "No," Wren said. "She left it there." Kaelin set the bundle down. He looked at it for another moment. Then he picked up his pen and went back to his papers, and Wren, who knew better than to say anything, excused himself and went to bed. The bundle sat on the desk all night. In the morning it was on the shelf beside the window, where the light would reach it in the afternoon. Nobody commented on this. Not even Wren. The water rights dispute was settled within the week. 3 other matters were resolved. A delegation from the Northern Pack was received and sent home satisfied, and Kaelin Dre moved through all of it with his usual precision. He was present. He was effective. He handled everything that needed handling. And every evening, without quite meaning to, he sat at the window of his study and watched the light change in the sky above the tree line, in the direction of Edenvale, and thought about a woman he had never met, who left lavender bundles on a laundry line for a thief she could have reported to anyone, and had not. He had not decided anything yet. But the deciding was coming. He could feel it the way wolves feel weather, before the clouds, before the wind, in the particular quality of the air, the way everything goes very still just before something begins. He went back to his papers. He read the same paragraph 3 times. He gave up and looked at the window again. Outside, the sky was the color of the inside of a shell, pale pink and pale blue, and the tree line was dark against it, and somewhere behind those trees, 12 kilometers south, a woman was hanging her laundry in the amber light, and tucking lavender sachets into every hem, and not looking over her shoulder. Or perhaps she was. He thought she probably was. The idea that she was watching the tree line the way he was watching the sky, did something strange and warm to the inside of his chest, and he sat with that feeling for a moment, just a moment, before he set it aside with everything else and went back to work. But he set it aside more carefully than he set aside other things, like something you want to be able to find again. There was a particular kind of cold that came off the pack territory in the early mornings, before the sun had reached the tree line. It was not wind exactly, it was stillness, a dense, watchful stillness, that the border towns had learned to live beside the way you live beside a river, always aware of the sound of it, even when you are not looking at it. Maren had woken in that stillness every morning for 2 years, ever since she had moved to Edenvale, and she had made her peace with it. She made her tea, she opened her kitchen window, and she listened to the quiet for exactly as long as it took the kettle to boil. Then she got to work. She was a herbalist, not the kind who sold dried bundles to tourists or made remedies with dramatic names for minor complaints. She was the working kind, the kind that people came to at odd hours with real problems. A farmer whose horse had a joint swelling that the usual tincture was not touching. A mother whose child had a persistent cough that had lasted 3 weeks past the cold. An old woman whose sleep had become shallow and broken, and who had tried everything the other healers offered. Maren listened to them all with the same calm attention, asked the questions they had not thought to answer, and then went into her workroom and figured out what was actually needed. The workroom was the best room in the cottage. She had claimed it immediately, before she had even unpacked her kitchen, lining the shelves with her jars and bundles and pressing cloths, hanging her drying racks from the ceiling beams until the room smelled like the inside of a summer forest. She spent more hours in here than anywhere else. She did her best thinking here, surrounded by the patient silence of dried plants and clean glass. She was thinking now. She stood at her workroom table with her hands flat on the wood, and looked at the ash she had swept up from the yard that morning. She had laid a thin line of it along the base of the eastern fence last night, in the soft ground between the fence posts. She had not mentioned this to anyone. She had simply gone out after dark, in her coat, with a small bucket of fireplace ash, and laid the line as carefully as she laid out a new planting bed, even, methodical, without drama. The line had been disturbed in one place only, directly below the center of the laundry line, where something very large had crossed it going in, and then crossed it again, going out. The prints were the same as before, but she had more detail this time, the full shape of the rear paw, the deep impression of the heel pad, the spread of the toes. She had measured the print with her hand span. It was wider than both her hands placed side by side. This was not a small wolf. She had known that already, in an abstract way, but the measurement made it concrete. This was a wolf that would have stood, at the shoulder, somewhere around the height of her kitchen table, which was not unheard of for the older pack wolves, the ones who had been in their animal form long enough that it had deepened and expanded with age and rank. But it was not common either. Wolves of that size were not common. They usually meant something. She put the ash away and washed her hands and made a fresh cup of tea and sat down with it at the table. She was not going to report this. She had considered that option and set it aside. Reporting unusual wolf activity near the border was technically something the town council encouraged, and technically she could have walked to the small council hall at the end of the main street and told them that something large was crossing her fence at night and taking items from her laundry line. They would have sent a message to the pack liaison. The pack liaison would have passed it up whatever chain of authority wolves used. Someone would have investigated. The thought of an investigation into a wolf who was, as far as she could tell, taking her laundry and doing nothing else. No threatening behavior, no damage, no aggression, just theft of household linen, struck her as both unnecessary and, for reasons she could not cleanly articulate, wrong. Like she would be interrupting something. Like whatever this was, it was not a threat, and treating it like one would change it into something that could not be unchanged. She also, if she was being honest with herself, and she generally was, found the whole thing rather compelling. She had grown up on the edges of pack territory. She had grown up with the stories, the ones that parents told children partly as warnings and partly she had always suspected, because the stories were just genuinely interesting. Stories about wolves who were something more than wolves, who carried rank and intelligence and old power in the shape of their animal selves, who moved through the world with a kind of total attention that humans had largely traded away in exchange for being able to worry about abstract things. She had never placed much weight on the frightening parts of those stories. She had always been more interested in the texture of them, the detail, the particular quality of attention they described. Something that paid that kind of attention had been coming to her fence. It had taken her things, yes, but it had not taken anything she needed, and it had come quietly, and it had left quietly. And it had not done anything that was not, in its own peculiar way, almost polite. And it had taken the lavender bundle. That was the part she kept coming back to. She had tied that bundle herself, from the fresh plants in her garden, and hung it deliberately at eye height at the fence post. It was not something that blew off a laundry line by accident. It was placed, and it had been taken, and whoever had taken it had known it was placed. There was a conversation in that, a small, wordless one, but a conversation nonetheless. She got up, went to the garden, cut 3 more lavender stems, tied them with a white thread, and put them in water on her windowsill. Not for the line yet. She was not ready to put them on the line yet. She wanted to think a little longer. She thought for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she went back out to the yard with the lavender bundle, and looked at the laundry line and the fence and the tree line beyond. The morning was clear and cold. The sky was very blue. She could smell the damp grass and the wood smoke from her chimney, and, faintly, from the north, the deep green smell of old forest. She tied the lavender to the line at the same place as before. Then she went inside and got on with her work. 3 kilometers into the trees, Wren was sitting on a fallen log reading a letter from the Eastern Pack liaison when a younger wolf named Dav, barely 4 years into his shift, still excitable in the way of young wolves who have not yet learned to disguise it, came running through the trees and stopped short when he saw who was sitting on the log. "The Eastern briefing," Wren said, without looking up from the letter. "It's on my desk, 2nd drawer. Do not touch the 3rd drawer." Dav said. "I wasn't. I came to say that the Alpha King is in the northern yard, and he's been there for an hour, and he won't speak to anyone." Wren looked up from the letter. "He's in his human form," Dav added, which was apparently supposed to be reassuring, but landed in the air between them with an uncertain weight. Wren folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, and stood up. "Tell whoever asked that the Alpha King is reviewing the northern boundary assessment. Tell no one else anything." He walked back toward the hall. The northern yard was a training ground, used most mornings by the younger wolves, and cleared by mid-morning. At this hour it was empty except for Kalen, who stood in the center of it with his hands behind his back and his face turned toward the southern sky. He was dressed for council. Dark coat, good boots, the kind of quiet formality that said he had started the morning intending to do something entirely different with it. He did not move when Wren walked in. He did not appear to be doing anything at all. He was simply standing there, looking south, very still. Wren stood beside him, and also looked south. He could not see anything interesting. He could see trees, and sky, and more trees. After a long time, Kalen said, "She's put another one out." Wren said, "Has she?" "Lavender again." Wren said nothing. He waited. "3rd one," Kalen said, "since the 1st bundle." "She seems to have a surplus," Wren said carefully. Kalen did not respond to that. He kept looking at the sky. The particular quality of his stillness was one Wren recognized. It was not the stillness of a man at rest. It was the stillness of a man who has a great many things happening inside him, and has made the decision not to let any of them reach his face. "You should go," Kalen said. "Of course," Wren said. "Tonight, not last night." "Understood." "And Wren," a pause, "walk the perimeter of the yard before you go in. The full perimeter. Take your time." Wren looked at him. Kalen was still looking at the sky. "She may have laid something," he said. "She's a careful person. I don't want her startled." Wren noted 3 things simultaneously. 1. Kalen knew this woman was careful despite having never spoken to her. 2. The word startled instead of alerted or disturbed, a word that showed concern for her state of mind, rather than concern about operational security. 3. The Alpha King had just used the phrase, "she's a careful person," in the tone of a man who finds that quality specifically admirable, rather than generally neutral. He filed all 3 things. "The full perimeter," Wren confirmed. That night, Wren walked the full perimeter of Marin's yard slowly, as instructed, before approaching the fence. He found the ash line on his 2nd circuit, thin, barely visible in the moonlight, laid close against the fence base. He stopped and crouched and looked at it for a moment. Then he stood up, took a wide step over it without disturbing it, reached through the fence, unclipped the lavender bundle from the line, and stepped back over the ash without touching it. He was not sure if that was the right thing to do, but it seemed right. It seemed like what she would want, for her small, careful trap to be acknowledged rather than simply broken. He reported back to Kalen in full, including the ash line, and watched the Alpha King's expression do something brief and complicated, that ended in the same composed stillness it had started in. "She's testing the perimeter," Kalen said. "It appears so." "She's not afraid." "No," Wren said. "She doesn't seem to be." Kalen turned the lavender bundle in his hand. Once. "Good," he said, quietly, to no one in particular, and then he went back to his papers. The lavender bundle went to the windowsill. The previous two were already there. Wren pretended not to notice. In the morning, the bundle's scent had mixed with the scent of the room. Firewood, paper, old leather from the chairbacks, and the study smelled different now, softer, like the inside of a house where someone actually lived. Kalen noticed it and said nothing. He sat down at his desk and opened the first report of the day and read it completely, for the first time in weeks, without losing his place. He was not sure what that meant. He suspected it meant something. Meanwhile, in Edenvale, Maren went out to her yard in the morning and found the ash line intact, undisturbed, except for one careful crossing. 2 prints in, 2 prints out, the same size as before, placed with deliberate care just over the line rather than through it. She looked at those prints for a long time. Then she went inside, washed her hands, and sat at her kitchen table with her tea, and thought about a creature that was large enough to frighten most people, but had stepped over her trap, so carefully, like it was leaving her a message. Not a threatening message, just an answer. She had asked a question. She had laid her ash and her careful bundle and waited to see what came back. What came back was, "I see what you did. I am being careful with it." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she turned to her workroom and her morning's work, and she hummed to herself while she sorted the new batch of dried chamomile into the clean jars, and she thought about careful things, and about answers given without words, and about whatever it was that was beginning to grow in the space between her fence and the tree line. It was not a comfortable thing, this growing, but it was not an uncomfortable thing either. It was the feeling of a seed in soil, patient and potential, not yet what it was going to become. She hummed to herself and filled her jars and waited to see what happened next. 2 weeks later, Kalen Dre called a full council meeting, settled 4 disputes, approved a grain distribution plan for the winter, declined a territorial offer from the Western Coalition, and sat through dinner with his senior advisors listening to them talk about alliances and future arrangements, and the general opinion that the Alpha King should consider, at some point in the not-too-distant future, thinking about a long-term partnership that would be good for the territory. He listened to all of this. He said, "I'll consider it," in the tone that meant the subject was closed. After dinner, he sat alone in his study for 2 hours. On his windowsill, 3 lavender bundles sat in a line, their scent quiet and persistent, and the study smelled like someone else's home, and he sat in that smell and looked at the window and did not think about long-term arrangements or territorial alliances or any of the other things that a king his age was supposed to be thinking about. He thought about ash lines and careful footprints and a woman who had left a trap for him and then left him a bundle of flowers at the same time because she was testing him, and also, he suspected, leaving him a door. He had not walked through it yet. He did not know when he would. But he was learning the shape of it, this door. He was learning it from 12 kilometers away, one piece of stolen linen at a time, and the learning was slow and patient and, he was beginning to admit to himself, the most interesting thing that had happened to him in 11 years. The sock disappeared on a Tuesday. Maren did not discover this until Wednesday morning, when she pulled the laundry in before the rain came, and counted items as she unclipped them, not because she distrusted her memory but because counting things was a habit she had built into her days, the same way she built in tea and morning light, and at least one window open no matter the temperature. 12 items out, 11 items in. She stood at the line with 11 items in the basket and 1 empty peg, and looked at it. A sock. She had hung a matched pair. She always matched her socks before hanging them, another habit from her grandmother, who had strong opinions about the chaos caused by unsorted laundry. They had hung side by side, one touching the other. Now one was gone. Just the one. The other remained, clipped neatly, still faintly scented with the lavender she had packed into the laundry water. She picked up the remaining sock and held it. She pressed her lips together. She was trying not to do something that she was beginning to suspect she was actually going to do. She was going to laugh. She pressed her lips together harder and took the remaining sock inside and put it on the pile of things waiting to be folded, and thought very sternly about the fact that this was, objectively speaking, a problem. Something was coming to her yard at night, something very large, something that had now, over the course of several weeks, taken 2 pillowcases, 1 scarf, 1 fresh lavender bundle, 2 additional lavender bundles, and 1 sock. 1 sock. She sat down at the kitchen table and thought about that. About what kind of creature, what kind of presence, chose a single sock from a matched pair and left the other one hanging. It was almost considerate, in a lopsided way. "Here is your sock. I have taken the other one. I am sorry about the asymmetry. Possibly. Or possibly not sorry at all." She put her chin in her hand and thought. What she knew, assembled carefully, The creature was a wolf, very large, which in pack territory meant it was likely old and high-ranking, because wolves of that size did not come in the ordinary varieties. It moved with care and precision. It could read an ash line and step over it without disturbing it, which meant it was paying close, deliberate attention to her yard even when she was not in it. It took only what it could reach through or over the fence, which meant it was choosing not to come in, choosing, not unable, because an animal that could step as carefully as it did could certainly manage a fence. It had accepted her lavender bundles and not come closer. It had maintained a distance that was, now that she thought about it, respectful. Respectful. She turned that word over and looked at it from the different sides. She had heard stories. Everyone in the border towns had heard stories about pack wolves and something called recognition, the word used for when a wolf identified a particular person as significant to them, which was a polite way of describing something much more complicated and specific and rare, that Maren had always assumed was largely embellished legend when she heard about it. She had grown up on those stories the way she had grown up on all border town stories, understanding them as partly true and partly shaped by the telling, not to be dismissed, but not to be taken at full face value either. She was not going to assume she knew what this was. But she was going to be honest with herself about the possibility. She went to her workroom. She had orders to fill: a jar of comfrey salve for the blacksmith 2 streets over, a tincture for the miller's wife who could not sleep, a bundle of dried yarrow for the midwife at the edge of town. She worked through the morning with her hands busy and her mind chewing on the thing quietly, in the background, the way she chewed on all problems, not forcing it, just keeping it warm. By midday she had made a decision. She was going to find out more. Not by going to the pack hall, not by asking anyone, because asking anyone would mean explaining the laundry thefts, and she had the strong feeling that explaining the laundry thefts would cause a great deal of fuss that nobody needed. She was going to find out more the same way she found out about everything, by looking carefully, by asking good questions, and by waiting for the answers to come back in whatever shape they came back in. The first question she wanted to ask was, what does it look like? She had the prints. She had the general shape of the thing from the brief impression she had caught of movement in the trees once or twice. At the edge of sight, more sensation than image. She knew it was large and gray and very quiet. She knew it moved like something that was used to being in charge of the ground it stood on. She wanted to see it, not to confront it, not to chase it off or challenge it, or do anything that would change the careful, wordless negotiation they had been conducting at the laundry line for the past several weeks. She just wanted to see it. She was curious in the specific way that herbalists are curious. Not chaotic, not reckless, but persistent and thorough. The kind of curiosity that does not rest until it has the whole picture. She planned it the way she planned everything, methodically, without drama. She moved her bed against the window that faced the yard. She rearranged the curtain so she could see through a gap without being obviously visible from outside. She put her darkest cloak on the hook by the door and put her softest shoes underneath it. She set a candle on the nightstand and did not light it, so her eyes would be fully adjusted to the dark. She waited. The first night, nothing, or almost nothing. A sound, once, at the tree line, that could have been an animal, or could have been the wind. She fell asleep in the chair at some point after midnight and woke with a stiff neck and a cold cup of tea. The second night, rain, hard and relentless, which meant she could see nothing and hear less. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and felt practical about it. The third night was clear and cold and very still. She was sitting at the window in her dark cloak, having taken her softest shoes off 2 hours earlier because her feet were cold and she had decided that bare feet were quieter anyway, when she saw it. It came from the north, along the tree line, moving parallel to the fence. She almost did not see it. It was the particular gray that belongs to deep shadow, the gray of old stone and winter bark, and it moved with an absolute silence that made the darkness around it seem loud by comparison. She held completely still, barely breathing, watching the shape resolve out of the tree line with every step. It was enormous. She had known this in the abstract, from the prints and the general evidence. But there was a difference between knowing something abstractly and seeing it in front of you, and the difference arrived in her chest as a feeling that was not quite fear and not quite awe, and was actually some combination of both that did not have a clean name. The wolf moved with a steadiness that was almost meditative, each step placed with precise intention, and it was indeed the gray she had imagined, a deep, layered gray that shifted in the moonlight between the color of old ash and the color of the sky before rain. It stopped at the fence. For a moment it simply stood there, and she understood, watching it, that it was checking the line of ash. She had not laid a new ash line. She had not done anything to the yard at all these past 3 nights. wanting to see what it did when the yard was simply normal and quiet. It checked the perimeter anyway, out of habit, she thought, or out of care, and then it lifted its head and looked at the laundry line. She had hung a new scarf, a blue one, wool, that she had been meaning to replace anyway. She had tied a fresh lavender sachet to it. The wolf looked at the scarf for a long time. It did not take it immediately, the way an animal taking something would. It looked at it with the kind of deliberate, examining attention that Marin associated with people making decisions, not animals following instinct. Then it lifted its head further, and it looked at the window. Marin went very still. It could not see her. She was sure of that. She was in the dark, behind a curtain, with the candle unlit and no light behind her. And yet the wolf's gaze went precisely to the gap in the curtain where she was sitting, and stayed there, and for a long moment, 10 seconds, 15, 20, nothing in the yard moved at all. Then it looked away. It reached through the fence with a care that surprised her, given how large it was. A careful, almost delicate motion, and took the scarf. It did not tear the lavender sachet from the fabric. It took both together. It turned and walked back into the tree line. It did not look at the window again. Marin sat in her chair for a long time after it was gone. She was thinking about the way it had looked at the window, and the way it had looked away, and what the difference between those two things meant. Because there had been a difference. She was certain of it. The looking at had been checking, scanning, reading, making sure. But the looking away had been something else. It had been the movement of something that had found what it was looking for and was now finished looking. Which meant it had known she was there. She put her hands in her lap and sat with that. It had known she was there. It had looked at her, or at the place where she was, which was the same thing. And then it had taken the scarf and gone without doing anything that could be described as threatening or escalatory, or anything other than what it had been doing all along, which was simply taking things from her laundry line in the most careful way possible. She thought about what kind of creature could be that large, that quiet, that deliberate, and could know she was watching and choose, in full knowledge of that fact, to simply proceed as usual. The answer that came to her was not an animal. Not exactly. Or rather, an animal that was also considerably more than an animal. An animal in which another kind of mind was also present and making decisions. She thought about rank again, about the size of the prints, about the fact that 12 kilometers north, in the tree line, there was a pack hall where an alpha king had been ruling for over a decade. She did not draw a conclusion. She was not ready to draw conclusions, but she filed the information carefully, in the part of her mind that was always building a picture of things, adding it to everything else she had gathered, and she sat with the growing picture and looked at it from all its angles. Then she went to bed. She slept surprisingly well. In the morning she baked bread, which was something she did when she needed her hands busy and her mind allowed to wander. She shaped the loaves and put them in the oven, and stood at the kitchen window watching the yard in the thin morning light, and she made a decision. She was going to leave a message. Not written, something more direct than writing, and something that could only be understood by something with more than an animal's understanding. She went to her workroom and stood in front of her shelves for a while, thinking about what she wanted to say, and what she had that could say it. She came out with a small bundle of dried lavender, her best batch, the kind she kept for her own use rather than for selling. Deeply fragrant, properly dried, tied with a piece of pale yellow ribbon she had been given once as a gift, and had never found the right use for until now. She went to the laundry line. She tied the bundle at the very center of the line, at precisely eye height for someone standing on the other side of the fence who was significantly taller than her. Then she stood back and looked at it. It was an invitation. That was what she was saying. Not an invitation to come in. Not an invitation to show itself in daylight or do anything that would change the nature of what was happening between them. Just an acknowledgement. I know you are there. You know I am here. Whatever this is, I am not ending it. She went inside and ate her bread and wrote up her orders for the afternoon. The bundle was gone by the time she got up for water in the night. She stood at the window in the dark for a moment, looking at the empty place on the line, and felt something she recognized. It was the feeling of a question being answered. Not fully, not finally, but answered enough to keep going. She went back to bed. For the first time in 3 weeks, she did not lie awake afterward, thinking about footprints and ash lines and enormous wolves in the dark. She had the information she needed for now. What happened next would tell her more. He told himself he was not going to go himself. He told himself this the morning after Wren reported that the blue scarf had been taken, that everything had proceeded exactly as it had on prior evenings, that there was nothing to report beyond the usual. He told himself this at breakfast, where he read correspondence from 3 different packs and drank his tea, and was, by any external measure, the same composed and effective king he had always been. He told himself this through 2 meetings, a boundary review, a discussion about the winter grain stores, and a conversation with his head trainer about the progress of the 3 youngest pack wolves who were approaching their first full shift. He told himself this right up until the moment he found himself, at dusk, in the northern yard, pulling off his boots. He shifted cleanly, the way he always did. It was not effortless, it was never effortless, but it was fast, and it was familiar, and the particular feeling of the world opening up into scent and sound and the deep-bodied fullness of his animal self was, as always, a relief. He moved south through the trees without thinking too carefully about what he was doing or why. He was running the southern boundary, that was all. He ran the southern boundary sometimes. There was nothing unusual about running the southern boundary. The boundary did not generally take him through the yard of a specific herbalist in Edenvale, but the boundary was a flexible concept tonight. He came out of the tree line to the north and moved along the fence as he had before, and he read the yard as he always read it. The ash line was not fresh, just the old residue of the 3-day-old ash she had not swept up, the lavender scent concentrated and still, the cottage windows lit with the warm amber of an oil lamp. She had been baking. The air held the ghost of it, bread and something sweet underneath, and the ordinary human smell of her house and her day. He stopped at the fence. He checked the line with the careful habit that had developed over weeks of doing this. The fence itself undisturbed, the gate closed, the ash undisturbed at its edges. She had not laid anything new tonight. The yard was simply itself, quiet and still, smelling of lavender and bread, and the end of an ordinary day. He looked at the laundry line. A blue scarf, wool, with a lavender sachet tied to it, just as Wren had described. He had not told Wren he was coming tonight. He had not told anyone. He had told himself he was running the boundary, and now he was here, and the pretense had exhausted itself. He was here because the sock was on his desk. That was the actual reason, and he was going to be honest about it, even if only internally, because dishonesty with yourself was a particularly corrosive kind, and he had spent 11 years being very precise about what things actually were and refusing to call them by other names. He had failed at this, thoroughly and repeatedly, in the specific matter of Maren Voss, and he was done pretending otherwise. The sock was a single gray wool sock, plain and clean, smelling of lavender, and he had no idea why Wren had brought it, or why he had told Wren to bring it, or why. Of all the things that had arrived on his desk in the past month, this was the one that had done something he was having real difficulty naming. But it had sat on the corner of his desk for 4 days, and he had not moved it, and that told him everything he needed to know about where he actually stood on the matter of Maren Voss. He looked at the laundry line for a while. Then he reached through the fence with the particular care he had developed over weeks of this, moving his large body with a precision that was almost dainty, which he was never going to think about again, and took the scarf. The lavender sachet stayed attached. He took both. He always took both. He was turning to go when the cottage door opened. He froze. Not the defensive freeze of an animal surprised by a threat. There was no threat here. It was the freeze of something caught, and he had not been caught at anything in 11 years. Not since he was young and still learning where the lines were. He was not 17 anymore. He was an alpha king with gray at his temples and more decisions on his conscience than he could count. And he was standing in a woman's yard in wolf form with her scarf in his mouth. She stood in the doorway. She was wearing a dark wool coat over her nightgown, which meant she had put it on to come out, which meant she had heard something and had made the deliberate choice to come outside and see what it was rather than staying inside and drawing the curtain. She had a candle in one hand, though the moonlight was bright enough that she did not actually need it. Her hair was loose, dark and somewhat disordered from sleep, and her feet were bare on the cold doorstep, which meant she had not waited. She looked at him. He looked at her. She was not afraid. He could tell this immediately, with the certainty that came from reading people the way his animal self read everything, from scent and sound and the particular quality of stillness. She was not afraid. Her heartbeat was elevated, but that was surprise, not fear. Her hands were steady. The candle flame was not shaking. She was looking at him with an expression that was, he identified it after a moment, sorting through what he knew of human faces, thoughtful. She was looking at him the way someone looks at something they have been thinking about for a while, and are now seeing for the first time in full. She looked at the scarf in his mouth. She looked at his face. She said, "You can keep it." Her voice was calm and clear and warm, not the warmth of someone trying to soothe a frightened animal, but the warmth of someone speaking to something they consider intelligent enough to understand them, which he was, which she apparently knew. He did not move. She looked at him for another moment, Then she nodded once, as if something had been confirmed to her own satisfaction. She stepped back. The door closed. The light in the cottage window stayed on for a while, and then it dimmed, and then it went out. He stood in the yard for 7 minutes. He could not have told anyone what he was doing in those 7 minutes. He was not processing information. He was not making decisions. He was not doing anything that could be described with the orderly words he applied to the rest of his life. He was simply standing in the dark with a blue scarf in his mouth and the sound of her voice still in his ears. 2 sentences, 10 words, spoken with the exact tone of someone who had not been startled, who had known this was coming, who had walked out in her nightgown and her dark coat in the middle of the night to look him in the face and say, "You can keep it," and then go back inside. He left the yard. He ran north through the dark, which was faster than walking, and gave his body something to do with whatever was happening inside it. He ran the full distance in 11 minutes, which was fast even for him, and he came back into the pack hall grounds and stood in the northern yard, and shifted back into himself in the cold night air, and stood there for a while, breathing. He carried the scarf inside. He set it on the desk, beside the sock. He sat down. He sat there for a long time, not looking at the scarf or the sock, looking at the opposite wall. His beta had left a message on the desk, something about the Eastern liaison, probably needing a response, and he picked it up and looked at it without reading it and put it back down. She had known he was there. That was the thing he kept returning to, not the words she had said, though the words had done something to him that he was not prepared to look at directly yet. The thing was the knowing. She had come to the door because she had heard something, yes, but she had already known what it was. That was in her face. The recognition in her expression was not the recognition of someone seeing a large wolf and recalibrating their expectation in real time. It was the recognition of someone seeing something they already had a complete picture of and were now putting the final detail into. She had built a picture of him over weeks, with ash lines and careful bundles and a study of his footprints and 3 nights at a window in the dark. And she had come to the door tonight not to discover what was in her yard, but to confirm it. She had known it was him. Not him specifically. She could not know who he was, but she had known it was not a random animal, or a threat, or anything that required caution of the protective kind. She had known it was the same thing that had been coming to her fence, consistently and carefully, for weeks. And she had come out to meet it. He sat with that for a long time. Then he reached forward and picked up the sock and turned it in his hands. 1 gray wool sock. It smelled like lavender, and like her house, and like the ordinary daily warmth of her life. The kind of warmth that comes from a home where someone actually lives, where bread gets baked and fires get lit and someone moves through the rooms in their softest shoes at night. He held the sock. He knew he should put it down. He knew several things he should probably do, including getting some sleep and writing a response to the Eastern liaison, and making a decision about the delegation that was arriving next week, and generally continuing to be the person he had been for 11 years, which was an organized and effective, and not in any way ridiculous person who did not collect laundry items from strangers' yards and keep them on his desk. He sat with the sock in his hand. In the morning, Wren came in to review the day's schedule and found Kalen already at his desk, already reading, already 2 cups into his tea, which meant he had been up before dawn. This was not unusual. Kalen worked early. What was unusual was the small collection of items on the corner of the desk: 2 pillowcases, a scarf, 3 lavender bundles, and what appeared to be 1 gray wool sock, arranged with the sort of particular unconscious care that people give to things they look at often. Wren reviewed the schedule. He pointed out 3 things that needed decisions. He received 3 clear, efficient decisions. He gathered his notes. "She saw me last night," Kalen said, before Wren reached the door. Wren turned. "Saw you." She came to the door. A pause. "Well, I was in the yard." Wren said nothing for a moment. He was doing the thing he did when he had very strong opinions about something and was deciding whether expressing any of them would be useful. "What happened?" he finally said. "She told me I could keep the scarf. Then she went back inside." Another silence. "She wasn't afraid," Kalen said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that Wren had not heard there before. Something that was not the usual controlled steadiness. Something that sounded almost like wonder. Wren looked at the collection of items on the desk. He looked at Kalen. He said, "I see," in the most carefully neutral voice he owned. Kalen looked at him. "That will be all, Wren." Wren left. In the corridor he walked very slowly, thinking about what he had just seen on that desk, and what he had just heard in that voice, and about the particular, very specific kind of problem that was developing in his lord's study. and about the fact that no one on the council was going to understand this at all, and about the additional fact that he was absolutely certain, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had spent 11 years watching Kaylin Dre navigate every kind of difficulty, that this woman was going to be completely different from every difficulty that had come before. He thought about her voice, calm and clear in the dark yard, saying, "You can keep it." He thought, this is already decided. He did not know how or when or what shape it was going to take, but it was already decided. He had been doing this job long enough to know when something was already decided. You could see it in the way a person held a sock. He went to get the morning's correspondence and left the rest of it alone, because some things were not his to manage, and this was one of them. The news traveled the way news always traveled in Edenvale, along the lines of ordinary conversation, from the bakery to the well to the blacksmith's door to the herbalist's gate, arriving at each stop slightly louder and slightly less accurate than it had been at the last. By the time it reached Marin, the morning after she had seen the wolf in her yard, it had accumulated 3 additional details that she was fairly certain were not true, but the core of it was apparently real. The Alpha King of the Voss territories was to meet with a delegation from the mountain clans. This was interesting in itself. Mountain clan meetings were rare, formal things that generally preceded something significant, either an alliance or a significant disagreement, depending on how the meeting went. But what the bakery and the well and the blacksmith's door were all adding to the core fact, with various degrees of certainty, was the suggestion that the meeting was not simply diplomatic, that the mountain clan's head family had a daughter of the right age, that this had been known for some time, that conversations had been happening quietly, between relevant parties, about the future of the Pack territories and the desirability of the Alpha King finally settling the question of a partnership. Marin received this information from her neighbor Clara, a weaver of about 60 with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, who delivered it over the back fence with the air of someone reporting something she had strong feelings about. "Clara," Marin said carefully, "you don't actually know that this is about a match." "I don't know it's not," Clara said. "Ellen at the bakery said the liaison told her, and the liaison said it came from the pack hall itself." "From the pack hall itself" is doing a lot of work in that sentence, Marin said. Clara gave her the look that 60-year-old women give herbalists who are being precise when they should be alarmed. "You don't find this interesting?" the Alpha King finally considering. "I find it entirely Clara's business and not mine," Marin said, and went inside. She stood in her kitchen and thought about this for a moment. She was not going to have feelings about this. She did not have enough information to have feelings about this. And having feelings about things before you had enough information was a good way to end up embarrassed. She was a practical woman. She had spent 2 years building a sensible, orderly life in a border town, and she was not going to disrupt it by having feelings about a wolf she had never spoken to who may or may not be considering a politically arranged partnership. She made tea. She drank it standing at the window, looking at the laundry line. She was not going to put anything on the line today. She had not planned to. She had a full morning of work ahead of her. 3 patients coming in, 2 orders to finish, a new batch of lavender oil starting. She was going to have her tea and then go to her workroom and be useful. She put her cup down and went to the workroom. She lasted 40 minutes before she came back out, went to the garden, cut a fresh bundle of lavender, and stood at the laundry line for a moment, tying it with her best white ribbon. She hung it at the usual place. She went back inside. She was being ridiculous. She was fully aware that she was being ridiculous, and she was choosing to be ridiculous anyway, which was something she almost never did, because being ridiculous was uncomfortable and she valued her comfort. But there it was. She had hung the bundle. She had done it because she wanted to, and wanting to was sometimes enough reason. She went back to her workroom and actually worked this time, steadily and well, and tried not to think about mountain clans or arranged meetings or Alpha Kings or any of it. 6 hours north of Edenvale, the question of mountain clans was presenting itself in a significantly less comfortable setting. The hall was large and cold, as it always was in the mornings before the fires had fully caught, and the delegation from the mountain clans had arrived the previous evening and been housed in the guest wing with every courtesy, and were now seated at the main table with the expressions of people who had something specific on their minds and were going to say it with full directness the moment the pleasantries were finished. Their head was a man named Gerald Fane, broad, gray-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who had been Pack Senior for long enough that it had settled into his bones. He was not an unfriendly man. He was a man who had an agenda and was civilized about it, which Kaylin actually found easier to deal with than people who had agendas and were not civilized. At least with Gerald you knew what you were going to get. What Kaylin got, after the food was cleared and the tea was poured, was a conversation he had known was coming for approximately 3 years. "We're glad of the meeting," Gerald said, "and I'll be direct, as I think you prefer." He looked at Kaylin steadily. "My daughter Petra is 26, and well-matched in temperament and pack strength to the requirements of a partnership at this level. The arrangement would be good for both territories. It would close a gap in the Northern Alliance that has been sitting open since the Vane Pack withdrew 2 years ago." Kaylin said, "I appreciate the directness." "I'd appreciate a similar directness in response," Gerald said, with the faint ghost of a smile. "I'll consider the arrangement," Kaylin said. This was what he always said. He had been saying it for 3 years to variations of this conversation. He said it the way he said everything he was not ready to engage with yet, cleanly, without hostility, with just enough room in the words for the other person to believe that consideration was actively ongoing. It was not actively ongoing. That was the truth he was not going to say to Gerald Fane across a table in the hall. The truth was that he had been considering it, once, in the abstract, the way you consider a task you know is coming and have not yet assigned a time to, and then something had changed. The change had happened in a market square, at the back of the stalls, with his nose in the air and his feet rooted to the ground, and it had not finished happening yet. In fact, it was showing no signs of finishing. In fact, it was intensifying, specifically and embarrassingly, in the direction of a woman 12 kilometers south who cut lavender in her garden and hung white ribbons on her fence posts, and came to her door in the dark in her nightgown and bare feet, and was not afraid of anything. Gerald Fane was a good man, and Petra Fane was probably an excellent wolf, and the Northern Alliance gap was a real and genuine problem. And he could not, when he ran the problem through his head honestly, make himself believe that this was the answer to it. He ran it through his head honestly, as he always did, and what he found was, no. A clean, quiet, entirely certain no that had been there for some time, and that he had simply been too careful to acknowledge. He was not going to say this to Gerald Fane today. He was going to find a better time and a better way. But the no was there, and he knew it was there, and knowing it, changed the quality of sitting across from Gerald Fane from one kind of discomfort to a considerably clearer kind. He listened to the rest of the meeting with his usual attentiveness and resolved 3 practical matters that were not about Petra and were genuinely useful to both territories, and sent the delegation away satisfied enough that their dissatisfaction could be addressed separately, later, at a time of his own choosing. That evening, after the delegation had retired and the hall had settled into its usual night sounds, Wren found him in the northern yard again. "She hung another one," Wren said, without preamble. Kaylin looked at him. "The white ribbon this time," Wren said, "not the yellow. Fresh bundle." Kaylin was quiet for a moment. The night was cold. Wren was watching him with the careful expression he used when he was choosing his words precisely. "I didn't send you," Kaylin said. "You didn't," Wren agreed. "I went on my own." "Why?" Wren said. "Because I thought you might want to know." A long silence. "I have to handle the Fane delegation properly," Kaylin said, which was not a response to what Wren had said, but was connected to it, in the way that most of Kaylin's statements were connected to each other. Logically, even when the logic required you to follow the thread a little distance. "I know," Wren said. "Gerald is a reasonable man. It's a reasonable proposal." "It is," Wren said. "The Northern Alliance." "The Northern Alliance is a real concern," Wren said, gently. "Yes, it is." Kaylin looked at the sky. She used white ribbon this time. She did. She's been using yellow. Yes. White is different. Wren said nothing, which was his way of saying yes to things that did not require him to actually say yes. Kaylin stood in the cold for another minute. Then he went inside. He did not go to the yard that night. He sat in his study with the desk and the reports and the Eastern Liaison correspondence and the collection of items on the corner shelf, and he worked with steady, focused attention until midnight, which he had not managed in weeks, and he thought about nothing except what was in front of him. When he finally went to bed, he was asleep before the candle burned low, which was something he had not managed in weeks. The white ribbon was on the shelf the next morning. He had sent Wren before sunrise. He had not examined his reasons too carefully. He had simply found himself awake at 4 a.m, fully awake in the particular way that meant his mind had made a decision while he slept, and the decision was that he wanted the white ribbon, and he had sent Wren before he had time to talk himself out of it. Wren had gone without comment, which meant either he agreed or he had accepted long ago that agreement was not the point. Kaylin held the ribbon for a moment. Thin, plain white, the kind you bought in bulk at a market stall. She had tied it herself, the knot simple and neat, the kind that comes from someone who ties a lot of knots in the course of their day. It smelled like her hands. He put it on the shelf. He went to the meeting with the Eastern Pac's trade representative and was, by all reports, his usual clear and effective self. Meanwhile, in Edenvale, Marin was having a conversation she had not expected. She answered her door at mid-morning to find a man she did not recognize. Compact, dark-eyed, watchful in the way of people who are paid to be watchful, wearing the kind of plain dark clothing that was meant to be unobtrusive and was slightly too neat to fully succeed at it. He was not large, not striking, not anything that would make the neighbor's eyes follow him down the street, but there was something about the way he stood that was very specific and settled, like a person who knew exactly how much ground they took up and was comfortable with the amount. He said, "Marin Voss?" She said, "Yes." He said, "My name is Wren. I wanted to speak with you, if you have a moment. I want to be clear that I'm here without anyone's knowledge, and I'm not here on behalf of anyone, officially." She looked at him for a moment. "Come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." He sat at her kitchen table in the careful way of someone not used to sitting in strangers' kitchens, looking at his hands and the table and the workroom door, and everything except her, with the directness of someone trying very hard to be respectful. She made the tea and set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him and waited. "How much do you know?" he said. "Probably not as much as you," she said, "but I've been paying attention." He nodded. He picked up his tea and held it in both hands and looked at it. "He's a good person," he said. Not as a defense, not the tight, insistent tone of someone making a case, just as a statement of fact, something he was putting on the table because he thought she should have it. "He's been good for 11 years, which is harder than it sounds. He lost something, a long time ago, and he rebuilt from it, and the rebuilding took everything he had. He hasn't had much left over for anything else." Marin said, "How long has he been coming to my fence?" Wren looked up. "Since 6 weeks ago. He caught your scent at the market." "And before that?" "He didn't know you existed before that." She held her tea. "He stood at my gate for 40 minutes, she said. "The first time." Wren's expression did something brief and complicated. "Yes," he said. "I should probably not have told you that, but you did." "I did." She thought about that. About 40 minutes at a gate, in the dark, and then leaving. About the particular quality of that kind of restraint. "The Mountain Clan," she said. "The delegation." Wren looked at her steadily. "Nothing is decided," he said. "But it's being discussed." "It has been discussed," he said. "For some time. He hasn't agreed." She turned her cup. "Why are you here, Wren?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I've worked for him for 11 years, and I have never seen him stand at a fence for 40 minutes. And I thought someone should tell you that." She looked at him. He met her eyes. She said thank you, and she meant it simply, without anything complicated underneath it. He finished his tea and stood and thanked her, and she walked him to the door, and he left down the lane in his 2 neat plain clothes, and she stood in her doorway watching him go. Then she went inside and stood at her kitchen window and looked at the laundry line and the fence and the tree line beyond, and she thought about 11 years and something lost and something rebuilt, and about 40 minutes in the dark at a gate, and about what it meant to move toward a thing so carefully you could be forgiven for thinking you weren't moving at all. She went to the garden and cut the longest stem she could find. She was going to need more ribbon. Wren sat at his own desk that evening and wrote out the day's summary in his neat, compact hand, a habit he had maintained for years, a private record of what had been decided, and by whom, and on what grounds, useful for the days when things got complicated and memory became unreliable. He wrote about the Fane delegation meeting. He wrote about the trade representative's visit. He wrote about 3 letters that had gone out and 2 that had come in. Then he stopped and held his pen over the paper for a moment and did not write about Edenvale, because some things were not for the record. He set the pen down. He thought about Marin Voss at her kitchen table, with her hands around her tea, asking her questions in the direct and unhurried way of a person who genuinely wanted answers and had the patience to wait for honest ones. He thought about the way she had said thank you at the end, not the reflexive thank you of social courtesy, but the specific kind that meant, "I have received something I needed, and I know it." He thought about the cut lavender on her table, in a glass of water, that she had not mentioned and he had pretended not to notice. She already knew, he thought. She had already made her own picture of the situation, weeks before he arrived to confirm it. She was not a woman who waited for information to be handed to her. She was a woman who collected it herself, carefully, in the patient way of someone who trusts that if you look long enough and honestly enough, the true shape of things reveals itself. He thought Kaylin had no idea what he was dealing with. He thought that was probably fine. He thought, more specifically, that Kaylin, who was one of the most capable and clear-sighted people Ren had ever met, in 11 years of meeting difficult people in difficult situations, was going to be comprehensively outmatched in the one area where capability and clear-sightedness turned out to be insufficient, and that this was the first time in 11 years that Ren had found that prospect genuinely, quietly, a little joyfully funny. He went to bed. In the morning, the council called an early meeting. This was not unusual. Council meetings were frequent, often called on short notice, usually about something practical. What was unusual was the way the room felt when Kaylin walked into it, a particular quality of held stillness, of people who have agreed to something before the meeting began and are now waiting to present it. Kaylin had sat in enough rooms with that feeling to recognize it in the first 3 seconds, and he sat down and looked at the 7 people around the table and waited. The senior council member, a woman named Agatha who had been in this role for longer than Kaylin had been alpha, spoke first. "We had a private conversation last evening," she said, "about the Fane delegation and the arrangement they've proposed." "I see," Kaylin said. "The council's position," Agatha said, with the gentle precision of someone delivering something they know is going to land poorly, "is that the arrangement with the Fane family is timely and appropriate. The Northern Alliance gap is a vulnerability we've been managing around for 2 years. Gerald Fane is willing to bring his full Eastern and Northern connections into a formal compact, which would address the gap permanently, and his daughter's rank is sufficient." She paused. "We'd like your approval to proceed with the formal announcement. The structure of the agreement has already been prepared." The room was very quiet. Kaylin looked at the table for a moment. Not at Agatha, not at any of them. At the table, at the wood grain, at the place where one of the earliest council members, decades dead, had once carved his name into the underside of the wood, as a young man, and everyone had pretended not to notice. It was a good table. It had held a great many decisions. "The agreement structure," he said, "has already been prepared." "A draft," Agatha said, "pending your approval." He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "The Northern Alliance gap is a real concern. I agree with the council on that." Everyone in the room breathed slightly easier. "I do not agree with the mechanism," he said, "and I'm not going to approve an agreement that I haven't chosen to enter." The room shifted in the specific way of 7 people, all deciding simultaneously not to say the thing they were going to say. "The council's role," he said, "is advisory. I am grateful for your assessment of the situation. I will address the Northern Alliance gap. I will not do it this way, and the formal announcement will not proceed." Agatha looked at him for a moment. She had known him for 11 years. She had the kind of face that showed very little by design, the same design that made her good at her job, but he could read her well enough to know she was not surprised. "May we ask?" she began. "No," he said, gently, but without room for negotiation. "Not yet." He left the meeting. He went to his study. He sat at his desk and looked at the items on the corner shelf and did not touch any of them. He called Ren. Ren appeared in the doorway with the face of someone who had heard about the meeting already, which meant it had been approximately 45 minutes since the meeting ended. Information moved at its own pace in the pack hall, and no one had ever successfully slowed it down. "You didn't tell me about the draft agreement," Kaylin said. "I didn't know about the draft agreement," Ren said. "If I had, I would have told you." Kaylin believed this. He believed it precisely because Ren had never, in 11 years, withheld information from him about anything that mattered, even when the information was uncomfortable. That was what made him valuable. That was what made him the only person Kaylin consistently trusted without qualification. "Gerald Fane will hear about this by the end of the week," Kaylin said. "Probably sooner," Ren said. "He'll want a conversation. He'll want more than a conversation." Kaylin was quiet. He picked up the white ribbon from the shelf and turned it in his hand, once, and set it back. "The Northern Alliance gap is real," he said. "Yes," Ren said. "It is. There are other ways to address it." "There are," Ren agreed. "It will take longer. It will require more work." "Most of the right decisions do," Ren said. A pause. "You went to see her," Kaylin said. Ren did not hesitate. "Yes." "Without my knowledge." "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. Kaylin was looking at the ribbon on the shelf. "What is she like?" he said, and the words came out more carefully than he usually said things, with the care of someone asking a question they have been holding for a while. Ren thought about this for a moment. Not because he needed to think about the answer. He had had the answer since the moment he sat down in her kitchen. But because he wanted to choose the right words, and Kaylin had asked in a way that deserved the right words. "She is very still," Ren said. "Not quiet, not passive. Still. Like someone who has decided not to be pushed by things. And the decision is so old, they don't need to maintain it anymore. It just is. Kaylin said nothing. She asked good questions, Ren said, and she listened to the answers the way you listen, not waiting for a pause so she could speak, but actually receiving what was being said. Still nothing from Kaylin. She had lavender and a glass of water on the table, Ren said. Fresh cut. She didn't mention it. A long silence. I see, Kaylin said. She wasn't afraid, Ren said. She hadn't been afraid through any of it. She'd been curious. Kaylin turned the white ribbon on the shelf once more without picking it up. She used white this time, he said, not as a question. She did, Ren said. Another silence. Then Kaylin said, Gerald Fane is going to be difficult. He is, Ren said. His daughter is probably entirely blameless in all of this. Almost certainly, Ren said. I will need to manage this very carefully. Yes. And honestly, that would be best, Ren said, in the tone that meant he was genuinely relieved to hear that word. Kaylin stood up. He went to the window and looked at the gray November sky and the tree line below it, south, where the trees thinned before Edenvale. I need to think, he said. Ren said, of course, and went to leave. Ren, he stopped. What did you tell her about me? Ren considered. That you're a good person, he said. That you've been that for 11 years, and that it's hard work. That you lost something a long time ago and rebuilt from it. He paused. That you stood at her gate for 40 minutes. Kaylin turned from the window. He looked at Ren with the expression he used when he was processing something that required him to remain outwardly calm while a great deal was happening somewhere below. You told her that. I did, Ren said. Why? Because she deserved an honest picture of you. A very long silence. She said thank you, Ren added. The specific kind. Kaylin turned back to the window. You can dismiss me, Ren said. I know, Kaylin said. I'm not going to. He was quiet for a moment. How was her tea? Ren blinked once. It was the most emotion he had visibly displayed in this conversation. Nettle, he said. Very good. Better than ours. Kaylin made a small sound that might, in another person, have been the beginning of a laugh. I'll speak with Gerald Fane this afternoon, he said. Clear my schedule until then. Ren cleared his schedule. In Edenvale, Maren was at her workroom table with the miller's wife, whose sleep still would not come, and whose eyes were carrying the particular bruised heaviness of someone who has not rested properly in weeks. Maren had tried 3 combinations already. She was trying a 4th now, a tincture heavy on valerian and ashwagandha, with skullcap for the underlying anxiety that she had come to believe was the root of it. She explained the preparation carefully. She explained what to expect in the first 3 days. She said that if it did not improve by the end of the week, she wanted to try something new. The miller's wife thanked her and left with her small glass bottle, and Maren cleaned her table and stood at the window. She thought about what Ren had said. He lost something, a long time ago. He rebuilt from it. The rebuilding took everything he had. She thought about 11 years, about the particular loneliness of rebuilding, the kind that is not visible from outside, that looks like strength from a distance because the work of reconstruction is quiet. She knew something about that. Not the same loss, not the same shape of grief, but the same quality of putting things back together when they had been taken apart, one piece at a time, in the dark, alone. She went to the garden. She did not cut anything. She just stood in it for a while, among the plants she had grown herself, in the soil she had worked herself, in the life she had built one careful step at a time in this border town at the edge of the forest. She had built it quietly. She had not been waiting for anything. She had simply been making something good, because good things are worth making even if no one particular is watching. But someone had been watching. For 6 weeks, from the tree line, in the dark. She thought about 40 minutes at a gate. She thought about a desk with a sock on it and lavender bundles lined up on a windowsill, which was an image she had built from what Ren had told her, probably not entirely accurate, but the part of it that mattered. A person keeping things because they wanted to keep them. That part she believed entirely. She went inside and put the kettle on. She was going to leave something else on the line tonight. Something that said, I heard what Ren told me, and I have not run away from it, and I think you should know that. She did not have a bundle prepared for that message. She was going to have to find the right thing. She stood in her workroom for a while, looking at her shelves, thinking about what it means to say something in the language of lavender and linen and white ribbon when you do not yet have words for it. She found what she was looking for near the back of the top shelf. A small dried wreath she had made last summer, lavender and rosemary braided together, for no particular purpose except that the combination of the 2 smells had pleased her. She had never hung it anywhere. It had been waiting, apparently, for this. She carried it outside. She hung it on the fence post itself, not on the laundry line, but on the post, at eye height, in the way of something permanent rather than something passing through. She went inside. She fell asleep in her chair by the fire and woke at midnight with a stiff neck and a cold cat on her feet and a particular kind of quiet in her chest that was not the absence of something but the presence of it, settled and still. The wreath was gone from the post. She was not surprised. She was also not calm, though she looked it to anyone who might have been watching. The laundry line stayed empty for 12 days. It was not a decision, she announced, even to herself. She simply did not hang anything. And the days passed, and the line hung slack between the two posts, slightly swaying in the November wind, and every morning she looked at it, and considered, and then went about her day, without going to the linen chest. She needed to think. The thinking was not the ordinary kind, not the clean, methodical analysis she applied to her work, where you gathered the information and assessed it and drew a reasonable conclusion. This was the other kind of thinking, the slow and somewhat inconvenient kind that happens below the level of method, in the part of you that does not respond well to being reasoned with. She knew what she knew. She knew it clearly. A man, something more than a man, had been coming to her fence for weeks, and she had come to the door in the dark and told him he could keep what he had taken, and it had been the most direct conversation she had ever had with someone she had never spoken to. She knew what she felt, which was something warm and patient, and also slightly frightening in the way that real things are always slightly frightening. What she did not know was what happened next. She was not a person who moved toward things before she understood them. She was not reckless. She had built her life on careful observation and honest assessment, and the principle that you do not put your hand in dark water until you know what is in it. This was not dark water. She was fairly certain it was not dark water. But it was deep, and it was unfamiliar, and the person standing at the other side of it had a mountain clan delegation on his doorstep, and 11 years of sealed grief, and an alpha king's worth of complications that she was, by any sensible measure, entirely unequipped to navigate. She thought about all of this. She thought about it while she filled orders and saw patients and tended her garden and baked her bread and did all the ordinary useful things that made her life what it was. She thought about it at the window in the mornings and by the fire in the evenings. She thought about it in the garden with her hands in the soil, which was where she did her best thinking, and what she arrived at, after 12 days, was this. She was not going to make this decision out of fear. Fear was not a good reason for any decision. It never had been. She had moved to this border town, alone, which people had thought was frightening. She had set up her practice in a community that did not know her, which people had thought was frightening. She had laid an ash line in her yard at night for a creature she could not see, which by most measures should have been frightening but had not been, because fear required a threat, and she had found no threat there, only something extraordinary asking for something she did not need. The laundry line staying empty for 12 days was not a decision based on fear. But it was also not a decision based on certainty. It was a pause. A real pause, the honest kind. The kind that says I am not ready yet to take the next step, and I am going to admit that, rather than take the step before I am ready, and do it badly. On the 13th day she went to the linen chest. She took out a piece of white cloth, a square of clean muslin that she normally used for straining tinctures, soft and well washed, new enough that it still had a mild clean smell without any lavender in it. She was going to change the message. She had been saying, I know you are there, I am not ending this. She wanted to say something different now. She wanted to say, I have been thinking, here is where I am. She pressed the muslin flat with her hands. She went to the garden and cut one lavender stem, just one, long-stemmed and straight, and pressed it along the center of the cloth, and folded the cloth around it once, loosely, the way you fold something you want to be easily opened. She tied it with blue thread, not the yellow she had used in the early weeks, not the white of the invitation, but blue, which she chose because it felt correct in the way that some choices feel correct before you can explain why. She went to the laundry line. She clipped the folded cloth to the very center of the line. She stood back and looked at it. It was a small thing, plain and simple, nothing that would attract any particular attention from the lane, just a piece of cloth on a washing line. She went inside. She did not watch the window. She made her dinner and ate it at the table and read for 2 hours by the fire, and went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept well, which surprised her. In the morning the cloth was gone. Only the blue thread remained, still clipped to the peg, stirring in the wind. She unclipped the thread and wrapped it around her finger and stood there for a moment, holding it. Something settled in her. She could not have said what had been unsettled and was now settled, but the settling was clear and distinct, like a room that has been slightly disordered and is now put straight. She pocketed the thread and went inside and started her morning. She was ready to be patient now in a different way than she had been patient before. The previous patience had been the patience of waiting to know. This was the patience of knowing and being willing to let the knowing be enough for now, to trust that whatever came next would come at its own speed, and that the speed would be correct. She did not know, and would not have guessed, that across the 12 kilometers of trees and cold November air, a man she had never spoken to was also reconsidering his pace. The conversation with Gerald Fane had been, as Wren had predicted, more than a conversation. It had been a formal meeting in the main hall, with Gerald's son present as witness, and 3 of Kaylin's senior council members present in the same capacity, and it had proceeded with the careful, formal courtesy of 2 parties who understood that the thing being discussed was significant, and that the discussion needed to be conducted with full respect for that significance. Kaylin had told Gerald that he could not proceed with the arrangement. Not, would not consider. Not needed more time. Could not. Gerald had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Is there something else?" It was not a question. Kaylin said, "Yes." Gerald said, "My daughter will be poorly served by a public conclusion if the situation is not clear." "The situation is not yet public," Kaylin said, "and I will not allow it to become public in any form that affects your family before it is necessary." Gerald looked at him steadily. "How long?" he said. "I don't know yet," Kaylin said. This was honest, and Gerald could hear that it was honest, which was why he accepted it. Honest uncertainty from Kaylin Dre was more trustworthy than confident assurance from most people. Gerald stood. He was not happy. He was not going to pretend to be happy, because he was a man who respected directness, and he showed that respect by being direct himself. "I will hold this quietly," he said, "for now, but Petra is not indefinitely available, and the Northern Gap is a real problem." "Both of those things are true," Kaylin said, "and I hold them seriously." Gerald left. The council, which had been silent throughout this meeting, waited until Gerald was gone and then looked at Kaylin with the collective expression of 7 people trying to decide whether to ask the question or wait for the information to arrive on its own. Kaylin stood. "I'll address the Northern Alliance gap by other means," he said. "Have the senior trade representative draw up the alternatives we've discussed. I want options on my desk by week's end." He left before anyone could say anything else. The next 3 weeks were dense and fast. The alternative proposals for the Northern Alliance occupied most of his waking hours, not because they were more complicated than the Fane arrangement, but because they were more complicated than anything straightforward, requiring negotiations with 3 different pack groups simultaneously, and a trade network revision that was long overdue. He worked through it systematically, the way he worked through everything, and it went well, and the gap in the Northern Alliance began, slowly, to close by different means than the council had expected. It was hard work. He had told Wren it would be. He had been right. He did not go to the fence during those weeks. He sent no one. The 12 days of the empty line had passed while he was in the middle of the Fane conversation and its aftermath, and he had experienced those 12 days in a specific way that he was not going to analyze too directly. He had simply noted the empty line, each morning, with the part of his attention that was always quietly tracking south, and he had understood the empty line without needing to interpret it, because some things communicate themselves without language. She was thinking. He was, in his own way, thinking too. And then one morning Wren came to his desk with a look on his face that was as close to neutrally careful as Wren ever got, and said, "She's put something out." Kaylin set down his pen. "Small," Wren said. "White cloth, blue thread, 1 stem." Kaylin was quiet for a long moment. "Just 1 stem," he said. Yes, he thought about that. 1 stem, not a bundle. The single, deliberate understatement of someone who had been thinking about scale and had chosen to say, "Here is the smallest possible statement, the quietest possible version, because this is where I actually am." He felt something move through him that was not like any of the emotions he was familiar with. Not the warmth that had been building since the market, not the restlessness, not the careful restraint. It was something that did not have a name yet, something that required more time and more of whatever was going to happen before it resolved into a recognizable shape. "Bring it," he said. Wren brought it. He held the folded cloth and felt the lavender stem through the fabric, and looked at the blue thread, and sat at his desk for a long time doing absolutely nothing productive. Then he opened the cloth carefully, and lifted out the lavender stem, and set it with the other things on the shelf, and held the cloth itself for a moment. White muslin, clean and plain, the kind of thing that passed through a herbalist's hands every day as a working tool. She had used her own materials. Not something decorative, not something that required any particular investment. Something from the center of her daily work, pressed around a single lavender stem and tied with blue thread. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about a woman who was precise and careful and who did not do things without intention, who had spent 12 days thinking and had come out of the thinking with one stem and blue thread, and what that meant about where she was and what she was saying. He thought, she is being honest. And he thought, I have to be honest too. He picked up his pen. He started writing something that was not correspondence, and was not a report, and was not any of the things he usually wrote. And he wrote it in the plainest possible language, because the plainest possible language was what the situation required, and he was a person who understood what situations required. He wrote for about an hour. Then he folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and called for his horse. He went to Edenvale. Not to her fence. Not in the dark, not in wolf form, not at night when the town was asleep and no one would see. He rode to the edge of town in the thin gray afternoon and tied his horse at the public post and walked down the main street of Edenvale, which was not an enormous street, but was well kept and busy enough at midday that several people noticed him and said nothing to his face and a great deal behind his back. He stopped at her gate. The yard was empty, the laundry line was empty, the cottage windows were lit, and through the kitchen window he could see movement, her, probably, working at her table. He looked at the gate for a moment. Then he opened it and walked up the path and knocked on the door. He waited. The sound of movement inside. A pause. Then the door opened. She was standing in the doorway in her working apron, her hands slightly stained from whatever she had been doing, her hair pulled back but escaping in the particular way of hair that has been pinned in a hurry in the morning and spent the day asserting its independence. She looked at him. He looked at her. For a moment neither of them said anything. He had prepared what he was going to say. He had written it down, actually, which was either very practical or slightly ridiculous, and it was in his coat pocket, and he did not need to take it out because he remembered it, but the act of having written it had organized something in him that had been disorganized for weeks. My name is Kalen, he said. I have been taking things from your laundry line. I apologize for that, specifically, but I am not going to pretend I regret it. I thought you should meet me, and I should meet you, in the straightforward way, before this goes any further. She looked at him. He looked back. Her expression was doing something he could not entirely read, not surprise, nothing like surprise, but something else, some complex thing that was moving through her face with a speed that did not match her usual stillness. Then it settled. Her chin lifted slightly. She said, "You have my apron." He looked down at himself, briefly, and then back at her. "I have your apron," he confirmed. He reached into his coat and produced it, folded neatly, the way he kept everything. He held it out. She took it. She looked at it in her hands for a moment. Then she looked at him. She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." Her kitchen was exactly what he had imagined, and also completely different from what he had imagined, which was the way things you have thought about from a distance always are when you are finally standing in them. He had imagined warmth, and the warmth was there. A fire going, the residual heat of baking from earlier, the particular layered warmth of a house that has been consistently lived in. He had imagined lavender, and it was there too, though subtler inside than on the laundry line, woven into everything rather than concentrated. He had imagined a workroom, and through the open door he could see shelves and jars and drying bundles, all of it ordered in a way that was clearly personal, a system built by someone who knew where everything was. What he had not imagined was the cat. It was a very large gray cat, sitting on the windowsill with the specific authority of an animal that has decided it lives here and the humans are guests. It looked at him when he came in, and then looked away in the manner of something that has assessed a situation and found it uninteresting, which, given that he was an alpha king who moved through most rooms like weather, he found briefly, genuinely funny. He sat at the kitchen table. She put the kettle on and moved around the kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of someone in their own space, and he watched this without trying to hide that he was watching it, because pretending not to watch when you were watching was a form of dishonesty he had no patience for. She moved well, not gracefully in the formal performative sense that people use that word, but with the practical ease of someone whose body knew its environment and did not argue with it. She set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him. He had rehearsed this, somewhat. He was not a person who improvised important conversations, or rather, he improvised them well, but he did not rely on improvisation for things that mattered. He had thought about what he wanted to say, and in what order. The note in his pocket was the backup, the skeleton of what he had thought. He did not need to take it out. "I want to be honest with you," he said. About what this is and what it isn't. She folded her hands on the table. All right, she said. I can't explain the beginning of it, he said. Not in any way that would sound reasonable to someone outside of it. I caught your scent at the market and I followed it to your gate, and I stood there for too long and then I left. I don't have a better explanation for why I did what I did after that. I'm not asking for a better explanation, she said. He looked at her. You're not, no. I've been watching you come to my fence for weeks. I think I understand it as well as you do, which is approximately, not at all, but entirely. Something in him that had been slightly braced since he knocked on the door eased by a fraction. I need to tell you some things, he said, about the situation as it stands, because you deserve to know them before this goes any further, and I don't think it would be fair to continue with what we've been doing without you having the full picture. She poured the tea. She pushed his cup toward him. Go ahead, she said. He told her about the Northern Alliance, not in the shorthand of pack politics, where a great deal was assumed, but in plain terms that a person outside that world could follow, what the gap was, why it mattered, what had been proposed to address it. He told her about the Fane family and about Gerald and about the arrangement that the council had drafted without his approval. He told her he had declined it, formally, and that this had created a diplomatic problem that he was in the process of managing by other means. She listened without interrupting. Her face was very still, not the stillness of someone suppressing a reaction, but the stillness of someone genuinely receiving information without converting it immediately into feelings. That's the practical picture, he said. The council will have opinions about this conversation. The pack will have opinions. I can manage both, but I want you to understand what you're walking toward, if you're walking toward anything. She was quiet for a moment. What are you walking toward? She said. He looked at her directly. You, he said. That's the honest answer. I don't know what shape it takes from here. I'm not going to make you promises I can't back with certainty, but you are the direction. That has been true since the market, and it has not changed, and I don't think it's going to. She looked back at him. He could not read everything in her expression. She was, as Wren had said, a very still person, still in the way of deep water, but he could read enough. She was not surprised. She was not overwhelmed. She was processing this with the same careful, honest attention she apparently brought to everything. I have a question, she said. Yes. The sock, she said. Just the one sock. Why did you take the one and leave the other one? He looked at her. Because you had a lot of items hanging, she said, and you could have taken any of them. You took the sock from a matched pair and left its partner. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I don't know. I noticed it was paired. I took one because I didn't want to. I don't know. I didn't want to leave you with nothing. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, almost to herself, she said, You didn't want to leave me with nothing. He did not say anything. She picked up her tea. I still have the other sock, she said, in case you were wondering. He was not entirely prepared for the feeling that produced in him. He was a composed man. He was not composed. They sat in her kitchen for 2 hours. She asked him questions, practical ones in the main, about the pack and the territory and the northern situation, because she was the kind of person who wanted to understand the landscape before she moved through it. He answered everything honestly, including the parts that were complicated, and the parts where there was no clean answer yet. She told him about her practice and her patients and her grandmother's house, and the reason she had chosen to live in a border town, which was not a dramatic story but was a complete one, and she told it with the directness of someone who has nothing to hide and is not going to pretend they do. At some point the cat came down from the windowsill and investigated his boots and then installed itself on his feet with a weight that was surprising for its size and went to sleep. And Maren looked at this and said, He doesn't do that, with an expression that contained a whole spectrum of things. No, Kaylin said. He's done it to one other person in 2 years, she said. He thought about saying something and then did not say it, because it would have been too much for the moment, and he was a person who understood the weight of moments and was careful with them. When he finally stood to leave, it was late afternoon and the light was going golden through her windows. The cat transferred itself to his vacated chair without apparent regret. She walked him to the door. At the door he turned. He wanted to say something, the thing that would close this afternoon correctly, that would be true and the right scale, and not too much and not too little. He stood in her doorway and looked at her and said, I'll come back, if you want me to. She said, I want you to. He nodded. He left down the path and through the gate and down the lane, and he was aware of her standing in the doorway watching him go, and he did not look back, not because he did not want to, but because some moments are better held forward. He rode home through the trees in the fading light, and felt, For the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, not the absence of something, but the presence of something, waiting in the specific near future that was about to arrive. He got back to the pack hall after dark. Ren was at the desk in the corridor outside his study, which was where Ren sat when he was waiting for something to happen, but had accepted that he could not make it happen faster by standing in a doorway. Kaylin walked past him and into the study and sat at his desk. Ren followed and stood in the doorway. "I went to see her," Kaylin said. Ren said nothing. "I went to the door, her door, in the afternoon," Ren said. "I see. Her cat slept on my feet." A pause. "Her cat," Ren said. "Yes. The cat that doesn't do that. The one she mentioned doesn't do that," Kaylin confirmed, with the careful precision of a man who had spent 2 hours finding out things about Maren Voss's life, and was not going to pretend he was not tracking all of them. Ren sat down in the chair across from the desk. He almost never sat in that chair. He looked at Kaylin. "How are you?" he said. Not the formal version, not the "how is the Alpha King" version, but the one that meant you, specifically, right now. How? Kaylin sat with that question for a moment. "Better," he said. And then, because it was true, and Ren deserved the truth, and also because saying it out loud made it more real, and real things needed to be said out loud to stay real. Much better. Ren nodded. He stood. He was going to leave, and then he stopped and said, "The council will ask questions." "They will," Kaylin said. "Gerald Fane will hear about this." "He will. The Mountain Clan. I'll manage it, Ren." A pause. "I know you will," Ren said. "I just want you to know that I think this is worth managing." He left. Kaylin sat alone in his study with the shelf of lavender and linen, and one gray sock and a dried wreath of lavender and rosemary, and now a folded piece of white muslin with blue thread, and the room smelled like everything she had sent him over 6 weeks, all of it layered now into something that was no longer separate pieces but a whole, accumulated presence, and he sat in it and felt, for the first time in 11 years, like the room he was in might actually be where he was supposed to be. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. He slept well. In the morning there were 3 urgent reports on his desk, and a message from Gerald Fane requesting a second meeting, and a note from the council asking for an update on the Northern Alliance negotiations, and he read all of them with his usual clarity, and dealt with them in order of actual priority. The window was open. The November air came through it. Somewhere at the other end of it, 12 kilometers south, there was a kitchen with a fire in it, and a large gray cat, and a woman who had said, "I want you to," with the specific precision of someone who means exactly what they say. He kept the window open all morning. The council found out on a Tuesday. It was not a dramatic discovery, no confrontation, no public scene. It came, as most significant information came in the pack hall, through the quiet accumulation of small observations. Someone had seen the Alpha King ride south on a horse. Someone else had noted that the ride took him in the direction of Edenvale, and that he had returned after dark with the specific expression of a man who has been somewhere that mattered to him. Someone had connected this to the weeks of disrupted council meetings and the rejected Fane arrangement, and the strange collection of items on the windowsill of the Alpha King's study, which various people had been not looking at for several weeks. By Thursday, the senior council had a full picture, assembled without any single person being told anything. Agatha called a private meeting. Just 4 of them, herself, 2 senior council members, and Ren, whose inclusion was the most pointed thing about the gathering. Ren came because Kaylin had told him to attend anything the council requested, and to be honest, without being indiscreet, which was a line that required constant recalibration, but was one Ren was practiced at walking. "Tell us what you know," Agatha said. Ren told them what they already essentially knew, that Kaylin had been visiting Edenvale, that there was a woman there, that this had begun before the Fane arrangement was formally proposed. He did not give them details that were not theirs to have. He gave them the shape of it. Agatha listened with the focused attention she brought to everything. "A human woman," she said when he was finished. "Yes," Ren said. "In the border town." "Yes." A short silence. "This is what the Fane refusal is about," she said. "The Fane refusal is because the Alpha King was not willing to enter an arrangement he could not commit to honestly," Ren said. Agatha looked at him steadily. "That is a very specific phrasing." "It is," Ren said. Another silence. "How serious is this?" she said. "Not what do you think of this, not is this appropriate, just how serious. The practical question, the one that mattered for everything downstream." Ren said, "I believe it is entirely serious." "Has he said that?" He has said, to me, that she is the direction. Ren paused. He doesn't use that kind of language for things he's uncertain about. Agatha looked at her hands. Then she looked at the two council members beside her. They were both silent, both running the same calculations she was running, and the calculations were not simple. A human partner for an Alpha King was not unprecedented, but it was not common, and it created complications of succession and pack bond and public perception that were real and required real management. Against that, an Alpha King who had been closed for 11 years and who was, by Ren's account, opening. Against that, the Northern Alliance gap, which needed a solution. Against that, the cost, which Agatha understood in her bones, of asking someone to choose the practical thing over the true one, and what it did to them over years when they had. She had asked that of someone once. She did not repeat her mistakes. "Will he speak with us about this?" she said. "He'll speak with you about anything you request," Ren said. "He's not hiding from it. He went to Edenvale in the afternoon, on his horse, in daylight. That is not the behavior of someone who intends to keep this private." "No," Agatha said, "it isn't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Gerald Fane is going to push for a formal response." "He is," Ren agreed. "We need to manage that carefully." "I believe the Alpha King is also managing it," Ren said. "He's been in correspondence with Gerald. He hasn't asked for my assistance with it." Another short silence. Agatha nodded, once, in the way that meant she had arrived at a position and was going to hold it. "All right," she said. "We'll follow his lead. But I want the Northern Alliance alternatives on my desk tomorrow, because that problem does not wait for anyone's feelings." She looked at Ren. "Tell him we'd like a meeting at his convenience. Nothing formal, just a conversation." Ren said he would. He reported all of this to Kaelin that evening, in the study, with the careful completeness he always brought to difficult conversations. Kaelin listened without interrupting, asked 2 clarifying questions and then said, "Agatha's handling it well." "She usually does," Ren said. "I'll meet with her Thursday," Kaelin said. "Clear that morning." He paused. "The Northern alternatives are nearly ready. 3 options, 2 of which are strong. Get me the draft by tomorrow afternoon." "Already prepared," Ren said. Kaelin looked at him. "You prepared them before I asked." "I prepared them before you needed them," Ren said. Kaelin was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in the specific way he meant thank you, when what he was actually saying was, "You understood what I needed, and you provided it without making me ask, and that is not a small thing." Ren left. Kaelin looked at his desk. He had been back to Edenvale twice since the first visit. Not long visits, an afternoon here, an hour there, fitting around the dense schedule that the Northern negotiations were demanding. He had sat at her kitchen table and drunk her tea and talked with her about things that were not councils and alliances, which was a category of conversation he had not had in a very long time. She had told him about a patient whose recovery she was puzzling over. He had told her, with more openness than he expected to feel comfortable with, about the 2 years following the death that had preceded the 11 years of sealing. Not the details, not the whole weight of it, but enough. She had listened in the way Ren had described, not to respond but to receive, and what she had said afterward was not a comfort or a solution but simply, "I know something about building from the ground after something breaks. It takes longer than you think it should, and it is more worthwhile than you expect." He had sat with that for several days. What he was less able to sit with, calmly, was the Gerald Fane situation. Gerald had sent 3 letters in 2 weeks. Each one was formal and carefully worded and increasing, in its careful wording, in its directness. The 3rd letter had arrived that morning, and it said, in essence, "My daughter has been in an uncomfortable position of not quite engaged for some time now, and I need this resolved one way or another before the winter gathering, where her status will be a subject of conversation whether we want it to be or not." Kaelin understood. He genuinely understood, and he felt genuine regret for the position Petra Fane was in, which was not of her making, and was being handled as carefully as it could be, but was still uncomfortable in the specific way that these things were always uncomfortable. He had written back to Gerald the same day, a letter that was honest about where he stood, that acknowledged Gerald's position and Petra's situation, and that committed to a final, formal public resolution before the winter gathering, which meant he had 3 weeks. He picked up his pen and began the 4th draft of the letter to Gerald that he was going to be satisfied with. In Edenvale, Maren was not thinking about Gerald Fane. She was not aware of Gerald Fane or the letters or the winter gathering or any of the intricate network of obligations that Kaelin was navigating on her behalf and on the pack's behalf simultaneously. She was aware, in a general way, that his situation was complicated, that there were things being managed that had timelines and pressures she was not fully informed about. He had told her enough for her to understand the shape without asking her to carry the weight of the detail. What she was thinking about was her laundry line. She was standing at it in the late November cold, pulling in the week's washing, and she was thinking about the fact that in 6 weeks, or closer to 7 now, this line had gone from a functional domestic necessity to the site of the strangest and most particular kind of correspondence she had ever been part of. She pulled the last sheet from the peg and held it for a moment, and thought about what had been said between her gate and the trees, one item at a time, in the dark, across 7 weeks of November, and felt the warmth of it settle in her chest in that same patient way it had been settling there since the morning she found the blue thread still clipped to the peg. She went inside. The cat was on the table, which he was not supposed to be on but which she had given up correcting because he was a cat and had no intention of being corrected. She put the laundry basket down and moved the cat off the table with the resigned affection of long habitual coexistence. She made tea. She thought about the morning, 10 days ago, when Clara had come over the back fence again with new information, this time not about the Mountain Clan but about the Alpha King being seen in Edenvale. Someone had seen him tie his horse at the public post. Someone else had recognized who he was and told someone else. By the time it reached Clara, it had a full set of opinions attached to it, ranging from the flattering to the alarmed. Marin had said, "I know," which was not what Clara had expected. Clara had stared at her. "You know." "He came to see me," Marin said. "He came." Clara pressed both hands flat on the fence top. "Marin, the Alpha King of the Voss territories came to your house." "He knocked on my door," Marin agreed. "And you?" "I made him tea." Clara had looked at her for a very long moment. Then she had said, in a completely different tone, "Was there anything left in those sachets, or have you given it all away?" And Marin had laughed, genuinely, which she had not expected to do in that conversation. She thought about that now, with her tea, in her kitchen. She was not a woman who had expected this. She had not been building toward it or hoping for it or manufacturing the conditions for it. She had been building her life, carefully and practically, in the quiet of a border town. And this had arrived at her fence the way unexpected things always arrived. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, accumulating pieces that added up to something enormous before you fully noticed the addition happening. It was enormous. She was honest with herself about that. This was not a small, contained thing that would fit inside the borders of ordinary life without adjustment. This was the kind of thing that changed the shape of ordinary life, and you had to decide, clearly and with full understanding of what you were deciding, whether you were willing to have the shape changed. She had been thinking about that for 3 weeks. What she kept arriving at was this: she had spent 2 years building a life here. She had not built it for anyone else. She had built it because it was a good life, and building good things was its own reason. She was not going to dismantle it. She was not going to subordinate it. She was going to find out whether 2 things could grow in the same direction without either of them losing their shape. She thought that was possible. She thought, with the careful honesty she applied to all important assessments, that it was more than possible. She thought it was the thing that was happening, already, in the particular way that things happen when they are right, not smoothly, not without difficulty, but with a kind of fundamental coherence that holds even when the details are complicated. She got up and went to the workroom. She had an order to fill. A new patient, referred by the miller's wife, a young man who had been working in the sawmill and had developed a persistent joint inflammation that was limiting his mobility. She had seen him once already and had a treatment plan in mind. She needed to prepare the first phase of it. She worked through the afternoon with her usual steady focus. At some point she heard hoofbeats on the lane outside and did not look up from the mortar, because she knew those hoofbeats now, had learned the particular pace of them in the past 10 days, and she knew he would knock and she would answer, and the afternoon would continue in a way that was, she had discovered, both entirely comfortable and entirely new. He knocked. She washed her hands. She opened the door. He was standing on her step in his dark coat with the gray November sky behind him, and there was a quality about the way he was standing that was slightly different from the usual. A tension in his shoulders that was not quite his ordinary steadiness, a quality of something being carried that he had not mentioned yet. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat at the table. The cat ignored him for approximately 40 seconds, and then walked across the floor and sat on his feet, which was now a habit the cat had apparently decided was permanent. "Tell me," she said, pouring the tea. He looked at her. "Gerald Fane has asked for a resolution before the winter gathering," he said, "which is 3 weeks. She sat. "What kind of resolution?" "A formal statement," he said. "Public enough to clear Petra Fane's position. which means public enough that everyone in the pack territory understands what the situation is. She held her tea. And what is the situation? He looked at her with the same direct steadiness he brought to every important thing. The situation, he said, is that I would like to know whether you're willing to let this become something official. Not for Gerald Fane's benefit, not for the council's benefit, for mine and for yours. But the practical timeline means the question can't wait. She was quiet. He said, I know it's fast. She said, it's not fast. It's been 7 weeks. He said, 7 weeks of taking your laundry. 7 weeks of correspondence, she said. She picked up her tea. I am not a person who makes decisions in a rush. I am also not a person who, once I have made a decision, requires a great deal of additional time to formalize it. He looked at her. I've made the decision, she said. He sat very still for a moment. Then he said, what is it? She looked back at him. Yes, she said. That's the decision. The particular quality of his stillness shifted. Not dramatically. He was still himself, still the composed and measured person she had come to know. But something in it relaxed, the way a rope relaxes when the tension in it has been properly met and held rather than pulled against. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and left it there, and she turned her hand palm up and held his, which was warm and large and certain in the way he was always certain about things once they were decided. They sat like that for a while, neither of them speaking, because the speaking could wait and this could not. Outside, November was doing what November does, gray and cold and steady, the kind of weather that demands nothing and asks you to simply be present inside it. The fire in the kitchen was going. The cat had not moved. The laundry line in the yard was empty and swaying, and through the window the tree line was dark against the gray sky, and somewhere in those trees there was a boundary between two kinds of territory, held and measured. And on this side of it a woman was sitting at a kitchen table with her hand in the hand of the person who had come to her fence in the dark. And the boundary was still there, but it was beginning to mean something different than it had meant before. He stayed for dinner. She made soup from the vegetables in her garden and bread from the morning's leftover dough, and they ate at the kitchen table with the fire going and the cat between their chairs looking alternately at both of them in the specific way of animals that have accepted a new arrangement and are deciding whether they approve of it. He washed the dishes. She looked at him at her kitchen sink and thought that this, specifically, was the image she was going to carry. Not the drama of first meetings or the formal weight of decisions, but this, a man at her kitchen sink on a November evening, sleeves rolled up, doing the ordinary domestic thing with the same focused attention he apparently brought to everything. He left after dark. She stood in the doorway and watched him go down the path. At the gate he stopped and looked back, for the first time, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the length of her yard. Then he left. She went inside. She sat at the table with what remained of her tea and thought about 3 weeks and winter gatherings and Gerald Fane and all the things that were about to arrive in rapid succession, and she was not afraid of any of it. She was ready in the same way the garden was ready in March, not knowing exactly what was going to grow, but prepared for the growing. She washed her teacup and went to bed. She slept well. The winter gathering was held on the first truly cold evening of December, when the frost came in from the north and the trees held it in their branches through the morning. The pack hall was lit from every window, and the sound of it, voices and movement and the particular warmth of a large building full of people who knew each other, carried out into the dark in the way of things that have been happening in the same place for a long time and have learned the acoustics of it. Maren drove herself. She had a small cart and a good horse, and she was not a person who required an escort for practical things, which she had said to Wren when he arrived at her door 3 days earlier with the offer of an escort, and which Wren had accepted with a nod that managed to communicate simultaneously that he respected this completely, and that he had expected nothing else. She arrived at the pack hall in the early evening, when the gathering was already full, and she tied her horse at the post and stood for a moment in the cold, looking up at the building. It was larger than she had imagined it, which said something about the gap between imagining things and standing in front of them. She had imagined it many times over the past 8 weeks, since the first sock, since the ash line, since the door in the dark, and her imagination had been reasonably good, she thought, but it had not quite captured the weight of the building, the way it sat in the landscape as though it had grown there, settled and permanent. She went in. The entrance hall was warm and busy, and for the first 10 seconds she was simply a person navigating a crowd, which was its own kind of invisibility, and she was grateful for it. Then someone noticed her, and there was a ripple of noticing, the way there always is when a known fact becomes visible, and she received a number of looks that ran the range from curious to cautious to outright fascinated. and she managed all of them with the same calm attention she gave to everything. Not performing anything, not deflecting anything, just being present. Agatha found her within 3 minutes. She had known she would recognize Agatha without having met her, because Kaylin had described her well, and also because there was a kind of person who simply looks like what they are, and Agatha was that kind, a woman in her 60s with silver hair, and the particular bearing of someone who has been the person other people defer to for so long that it has become structural rather than effortful. She looked at Maren with the clear, measuring attention of someone doing a real assessment and not pretending otherwise. "Maren Voss," she said. "Yes," Maren said. Agatha offered her hand. Maren took it. The handshake was brief and serious and told each of them what they needed to know. "He's been watching the door since you arrived," Agatha said, not unkindly. "Just as information." Maren looked across the hall. He was standing with a group of senior pack members, in conversation, and he had not moved toward the door, but the way his attention was positioned, the very slight angle of his body, the quality of his listening that was complete but also pointed in a specific direction, told her that Agatha was exactly right. She crossed the hall. She was not in a hurry. She was not performing confidence, not using any of the techniques she might have used in a situation that frightened her, because this did not frighten her. She simply walked across the hall of the pack in the quiet, unhurried way she moved through things, and the crowd made room in the way crowds make room for people who are going somewhere with purpose, and she arrived. He turned when she was still 4 steps away. He looked at her for a moment in the way he had looked at her that first afternoon in her kitchen, with the particular full attention of someone for whom looking at this person is still new enough to require all of their concentration. Then something in his face changed, and he said something brief to the person he had been speaking to and stepped away from the group and came toward her. He said, "You drove yourself." "I have a perfectly good horse," she said. He looked at her. He looked the way he always looked when she said something that he found, in his own way, amusing, not laughing, not even quite smiling, but with a quality of warmth that was very particular to him, and that she had learned to read and enjoyed reading. "The formal announcement," she said, keeping her voice quiet in the crowded room. "When is it?" "After the winter welcome," he said. 40 minutes. She nodded. "How is Gerald Fane?" "Present," he said. "In the East Wing. He's being civil." "That's something." "It is," he said. "He's a fair man. He knows this was handled honestly, and he knows Petra will be fine, and he knows the practical situation has been addressed by other means. He doesn't like the outcome, but he respects the process." She thought that was probably the best one could hope for. "And the council?" "Agatha spoke to me yesterday," he said. "She is cautiously supportive, which from Agatha is approximately the same as enthusiastic support from anyone else." "I thought so," Maren said. She shook my hand like she meant it. He looked at her, and then he did something she had not seen him do before. He smiled. Not the partial warmth she had learned to read, but an actual smile, brief and real, the kind that comes from being genuinely, simply pleased. It changed his face in a way that was so complete she understood immediately why he did it rarely. It was not a small thing when it happened. It was the whole thing. She kept her expression very neutral. He said, "Thank you for coming." "Of course," she said. "You have my sock. I assumed I'd need to collect it at some point." He looked at her. "And the pillowcases," she said. "And the scarf. And the apron, which you already gave back, but there was also the other scarf. And 3 lavender bundles, and I'm pretty sure there was a handkerchief in there somewhere." "There was," he said. "I'd like it back." "You can have it back," he said. "All of it," she said. He said, "Yes." She said, "Good." They stood there for a moment in the middle of the crowded hall, and no one around them could have identified exactly what had just happened in the exchange, because it had happened in the language they had been building for 8 weeks, the language of lavender and linen and blue thread and white ribbons, and it was not a language anyone else spoke. Ren appeared at Kaylin's shoulder. "The welcome toast is in 5 minutes," he said, looking at neither of them in a way that managed to convey considerable interest. They moved to the main hall. The winter welcome was long and warm and full of the particular ritual density of pack gatherings, which had their own rhythms and their own textures, and Maren stood with Kaylin through all of it and paid attention to the parts that could be followed, and let the parts that could not simply be background. She was not trying to understand everything. She was learning the shape of it, the way you learn the shape of a new place, not trying to memorize it all at once but letting it settle into you gradually. After the welcome, Kaylin stood at the front of the hall. It was quiet in the way of large gatherings when they go quiet. Not silence, but a specific held stillness, a collective attention. He said, "I want to speak to you about something that is both a practical matter and a personal one, and I'm going to address both in the same statement, because separating them would be dishonest." The hall was very still. "The Northern Alliance gap," he said, "has been addressed through the trade compact we finalized last week. I want to thank the Council and the Eastern Pacs for their work on that. The compact is strong, and it serves all parties better, I believe, than any single arrangement could have." A murmur of approval. Gerald Fane, somewhere in the east side of the room, was quiet and still. "On the personal matter," Kalen said, "Maren Voss, of Edenvale, is the person I intend to build a future with. This is not a political arrangement. It is a choice, made honestly and with full understanding of what it means, and it is mine to make." The murmur this time was more complex, surprise in some quarters, something warmer in others, and in one corner near the back what sounded like two people who had money on something and were recalibrating their position. "I don't require anyone's approval," he said, "but I appreciate that this community deserves to know where things stand, and they stand clearly. That's all I have to say about it." He came back to where she was standing. She said, "That was the shortest formal announcement I've ever heard." "I don't believe in long ones," he said. "Efficient," she said. "Always," he said. They stood side by side in the warm noise of the hall, and people came, some to speak to him and some, with varying degrees of courage, to speak to her. And she received all of them as she received everything, calmly, directly, with the particular steadiness of a person who does not need to perform anything, because what they are is sufficient. Agatha came late in the evening, after most of the formal parts were over and the gathering had relaxed into something easier. She came to Maren specifically, without Kalen, which was deliberate, and Maren understood it as deliberate. "He's been closed for a long time," Agatha said, without preamble. "I know," Maren said. "Not all of the council will be easy about this. I expect not. There will be questions about your role, about the pact bond, about succession, eventually, if things continue." "I would expect all of those questions to arise," Maren said. "I don't expect any of them to be easy. But I'm a herbalist. I'm used to complicated situations that don't have clean answers but do have workable ones, and I'm patient enough to find the workable ones." Agatha looked at her for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, because Agatha's expressions did not soften, but settling in a different configuration. The way a house settles after you've lived in it for a while, and it has made room for you. "He needs someone who won't be managed," she said. "I noticed," Maren said. Agatha's expression did the thing that was as close to a smile as it got. "Good night, Maren Voss," she said, and went to find someone else to speak with. They left the gathering together, past midnight, when the hall had thinned to the most committed conversations, and the fires had burned down. He walked her to her cart. Her horse was patient and warm from the stable, and looked at Kalen with the same considered assessment as the cat. "I'll follow you home," he said. "You don't need to," she said. "I know I don't need to," he said. She looked at him. "All right," she said. She drove. He rode beside her, through the December dark, through the trees and along the frost-hardened lane, and they did not talk much because the dark and the cold and the sound of the horses were enough, and some things are better held in quiet. When they reached her gate, she stopped the cart, and he dismounted and opened the gate for her, which she did not need, and accepted anyway. She put the horse in the small stable at the side of the house. He helped with the harness because he was already there, and it was faster with two people. They stood in the yard for a moment after, in the cold, with her breath making small clouds in the air. The laundry line was empty and still. She looked at it. She thought about 7 weeks ago, about a pillowcase going missing in the wind, about ash and footprints and one gray sock, about a fresh lavender bundle placed at eye height on a fence post by a woman who had decided to leave a door open, about a man standing at a gate in the dark for 40 minutes, choosing not to knock. "You could have just come to the door," she said. That first night, at the gate, he was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at the laundry line, then he looked at her. "Because I wanted to do it right," he said. "I didn't know what right looked like yet. I needed to find out before I knocked." She stood with that. 7 weeks, she said. 7 weeks, he said. "You found out what right looked like." "I found out one piece at a time," he said. "A pillowcase at a time." She looked at him for a moment. Then she went inside and came back with the remaining items. Not all of them. She had used the lavender bundles, but the blue thread and the white muslin and the piece of yellow ribbon, and 3 lavender sachets she had not put on the line yet. She held them out. He looked at them in her hands. He did not take them. He said, "Keep them." She said, "They're my things." "They are," he said. "Keep them here. I'll come back for them." She looked at him. "Every time," he said, "I'll keep coming back." She held the items and thought about that. About every time. About the particular quality of a promise made not dramatically but practically. The way you make a promise when you mean it, and you know what it means to mean it. She put the things back inside. She came back to the door. He was still in the yard, in the dark and cold, standing in the same particular way he had stood at her fence for 7 weeks, settled, certain. The wolf in him and the man in him in the same alignment, patient. "Go home," she said. "It's late." "I'm going," he said. He did not go immediately. She said, "Kaylin." He said, "Yes." She said, "Tomorrow." He said, "Yes." He went down the path and through the gate, and she heard his horse begin and fade into the dark lane, and she stood in the open door with the cold coming in and looked at the laundry line in the yard, empty and swaying, and thought about tomorrow. In the morning she rose early, and lit the fire and made her tea, and stood at the kitchen window in the gray December light, and the cat came and sat on the windowsill beside her, and they both looked at the yard in the companionable silence of two creatures who have made their peace with a new arrangement. She opened the window. The cold came in, clean and sharp, smelling of frost and old forest and the particular early morning quiet of a border town just waking up. She stood in it for a moment. Then she went to the linen chest. She pulled out the sheets that needed washing, the ones that had been waiting, and she went out to the yard in her coat and her softest shoes, and she began to hang them on the line. She worked from one end to the other, smoothing and clipping, and when she reached the last item, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a lavender sachet, a new one, full and fragrant, tied with blue thread because she had made a private decision that blue was the right color for things going forward, and she clipped it to the last sheet, precisely in the center of the line, at eye height, for someone standing on the other side of the fence who was considerably taller than her. She stood back and looked at it. Then she went inside. She left the window open. She had work to do, and she was going to do it, and later he would come, and the horse would stop at her gate, and the door would open the same way it had been opening, with the same simple, ordinary certainty of a door that has been used often enough to stop sticking. But for now the morning was her own. The laundry moved in the December air, white and slow, and the lavender sachet swayed between the sheets, and the yard was full of the particular quiet that comes after something has been decided, and before the next thing begins. A held breath between one state and another. A seam in the day where something finished and something else was just beginning. Right here, in this small, cold yard with its wooden posts and frayed rope and the sound of a border town moving into morning. She hummed to herself in the kitchen. She filled her jars. She waited for the knock.